go and get. I've got one on my back. Sorry, that wasn't. I don't know. That's a thirsty, right?
Give it a few more minutes with the rain.
Yeah, well, exactly.
We'll just give it a couple more minutes because of the rain, I think. Okay, I'm going to suggest that we make a start. So I just want to start off with an apology. It seems that I have brought the weather with me from Scotland, so for that, I apologize. So 360 video has long been touted as the next big thing. And indeed, both newsrooms and charities are increasingly embracing the format to engage and immerse their respective audiences in stories from the developing world. More like story living than storytelling, the technology enables the filmmaker to place the viewer in the middle of the story, allowing the viewer to rub shoulders with children in diamond mines, to stand on a boat as it rescues migrants in the Mediterranean, or to witness firsthand what life is like for one Rohingya woman in a refugee camp. Back in 2015, a long time ago now in terms of technological advancements, virtual reality pioneer Chris Milk coined the now rather cliched term empathy engine in a TED talk. He said, and I quote, that immersive technology such as VR and 360 connect humans to other humans in a profound way that I've never seen before in any other form of media. And it can change people's perception of each other. And that's how I think virtual reality has the potential to actually change the world. So it's a machine, but through this machine we become more compassionate, we become more empathetic, and we become more connected. And ultimately we become more human. But some have argued that this not only overvalues the medium's impact, but this is a gross oversimplification of how an audience engages or reacts to immersive 360 video. Conversely, others have labeled 360 video as poverty porn 2.0. Poverty porn, also known as development porn, famine porn, or stereotype porn, has been defined as any type of media, be it written, photographed, or filmed, which exploits the poor's condition in order to generate the necessary sympathy for selling newspapers or increasing charitable donations or support for a given cause. It is a term also used to explain when media is created not in order to generate sympathy, but to generate sensationalism, to cause anger or outrage. And so one could argue that with the great immersive power of this new medium, a medium that journalists are still figuring out how best to utilize, comes great responsibility. So how do we best harness this new technology? How do we get the right balance between true immersion and telling stories with sensitivity? How do we show what life is like in extreme situations without being accused of being sensationalist or parasitic? And how seriously should we consider the risk of vicarious trauma? And should local filmmakers be used to mitigate the extent of a colonial gaze? Today's panel hopes to address some of these important questions. I've been asked to slow down. Too much espresso. Today's panel hopes to address some of these important questions. This session will hear from myself and 3 other experts who, using some examples, will highlight not only the ethical, but also the logistical challenges of using this format and how they overcame them. These speakers have been deliberately handpicked as they have a range of resources and approaches among them. I'll be sort of approaching things as an independent freelancer. We have Joe Inwood from the BBC, as someone who's obviously working for a large international outlet. We have Victoria, and I'm not actually sure how to pronounce your last name. Okay, I'm glad that I didn't try. Who's from Al Jazeera's VR hub, Contrast VR, who's doing some really interesting, innovative stuff with 360. And last but not least, we have Geoffrey Monnier from MSF, who again, a humanitarian organization that is using 360 for varying different reasons. Each panelist is going to have about 5 minutes to give a brief presentation. Then, rather talking at you for 75 minutes, and we don't want you to fall asleep, we thought it'd be more interesting instead to have a lively, organic discussion between us. And then I'm going to make sure that we open it up for at least 20 minutes at the end so that we can engage in a conversation with you as well and have a chat. And just one last reminder, for half an hour after the session ends, we are going to have a sort of impromptu, informal VR pop-up outside. So we've got some Google Cardboards, as you can see, and my colleagues have also brought some Samsung Gears with some of the movies they're going to be talking about preloaded on them. So we encourage you to come and chat with us after and immerse yourself in these alternate, well, not alternate realities, but in these otherworldly experiences. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Joe to kick things off.
Hi everyone. So yeah, my name is Joe Inwood. I work for the BBC. Probably, actually, unlike Victoria, I don't work for a part that focuses specifically on VR. My job is, I'm a field producer. I go out specifically in the Middle East. And for me, my interest has always been how. Is that on? Okay. Yeah. So I don't know if I'll start that again, but I work for the BBC. My job isn't specifically 360. I sort of came to it almost not by accident, but I thought it seemed interesting a couple of years ago and started taking 360 cameras with me on what we call normal news gathering deployments. So I go out as a field producer, so I shoot, I edit, I do all of it. And what I then thought is, how can I add 360 into this workflow? How can we make it work? When should you do it and when shouldn't you do it? And I think that's one of the things that we found is there are lots of times actually when 360 isn't appropriate at all. You know, I remember a conversation I overheard a couple of years ago, someone saying, oh, you're going to a press conference, why don't you take a 360 camera? And the answer should have come back, because it's really boring. What we've learned is it's all about place. The first thing to say again, as you'll know, this is a really new medium. It's what makes it so exciting. That we don't have the established grammar. We don't have all of the established rules that exist and people stick to sometimes overly rigidly in other mediums. There's an evolving language, and that's why this is so exciting, but also why these conversations need to be had. To address the first question, if we can go on to the next slide. Is there a new editorial challenge here? Is there something fundamentally different about the way that we use 360? Now, I should say, this isn't a BBC policy thing. These are just my views. I don't work for the VR Hub. I work for myself and different units, so this is just my personal thoughts. I think there's often a sort of a rush to, not moral outrage, but certain moral uncertainty with new technology. Something comes out and instantly you can see the ways this is different. And so, for example, with 360, there are clearly issues around consent. How do you get informed consent from everyone when they're all on that boat? It's virtually impossible. And there are genuine questions around that. I don't have the answers to them. But what you can see here, up here, are two shots of the same event, one taken. The one on the left, that was a fixed point 360 camera, and the one on the right was from the big camera on my shoulder. And I think people forget, in thinking about how 360 is more invasive in some ways, they forget that in other ways it's far less invasive. So actually, whilst, yes, you do see everything around you, you don't see the whites of people's eyes. And I think this comes actually addressing both whether it is poverty porn or whether it engenders empathy. People forget the limitations of it. So I think, yes, there are some ways in which it's more invasive, more intrusive, but others in which it's far less. And in fact, there's show a couple of clips.
You want the next slide?
No, the next clip, the two clips. Okay. Sorry about this. And what you're about to see again is small sections from a 360 film of essentially the same event, and then what we did as the linear 16:9 video of the same thing. And you can see there are differences, there are similarities. I don't think it would be fair to label the first one poverty porn or intrusive and the second one very different.
Which one would you like first, Joe?
Let's do the 360 one first, so the other one. Nearly with you. Make it full screen. everyone is brought on board.
Please sit down! Please sit down! Act for everybody!
The migrants sleep across all 3 decks, and with the ship well over capacity, it is pretty crowded. Now, and then if we show the second one, please.
Fortunate ones can pay for wooden boats, but they too are overcrowded and dangerous. We're on a rescue ship run by the charity Doctors Without Borders.
So far they've taken more than 600 people on board from 3 different boats, and there's another transfer that's ongoing at the moment.
Most are men, but there are also women and children. All have risked their lives to make the dangerous crossing.
And there we are. Not saying there's any definite answers from that, but I just thought it was worth showing you a couple of different things to illustrate some of the differences, some of the similarities, and at which point I'll hand over to Victoria.
Thank you. So I present Contrast VR, which is Al Jazeera's in-house media studio. We launched only last year in April, and we use new and emerging technologies to do more immersive and innovative human-centered journalism work. And we aim to transport the audience to the people and cultures hit hardest by inequality and conflict. And while doing that, we are focusing on people who are innovating, striving, and bringing about change. That's really important to us, to focus on the communities that actually are finding solutions to their situations. So let's see the trailer for like a reel to see where we've gone, to what places around the world we actually produce the stories from. Working.
Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
So we went to many places, but we haven't done this alone.
Yeah.
Because many of our projects have been possible only through collaborations with local talent and local professionals from around the world. And one of our initiatives, first initiatives, was My People, Our Stories, and it was born in April last year as well. This was a collaboration between Contrast and Samsung, and we wanted to train 8 filmmakers from Middle East and Africa. We wanted to support new and emerging talent and create this global network of 360 filmmakers from the Global South. Because Global South is the place, is the region where many of us, a lot of people in journalism want to do 360 stories from, but we don't make the VR 360 technology available to those people from there, so they can actually tell their own stories through their own perspective and be a part of this VR ecosystem of storytellers. And we left those cameras for the people who we trained so they can continue doing stories. So we not only got 8 really powerful videos and short documentaries out of this initiative, but we actually continue working with them and continue producing more stories. They always come up with pitches and they always know how to contact us. And then soon after that, we understood that this framework of community storytellers really fits us and our sort of larger editorial strategy. And in January, we trained 7 Syrian teenagers, the next slide, who were interested in filmmaking and the storytelling, and we trained them how to use 360 cameras in the Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, and they produced their first 360 documentaries from the camp. And the stories were really interesting. Nisreen, so Obada, 16-year-old, he documented his passion for football, and the girls on the right, they're interested in theater and how this helps them to go through their daily lives in Zaatari camp. And then the second point I want to make, how we do stories and how we work in our productions, is that we try to include as much local talent as possible in all our original productions, which are longer documentary films. And the recent documentary, Yemen Skies of Terror, which will be the next slide, we involved local Yemeni journalists. We again trained them, and we gave them 360 cameras, and we got this rare footage from inside Yemen, and they were those stories that they actually wanted to tell and to show the world. We also involved the Yemeni musician who created music score for us. He was based in Sana'a, and Yemeni artists creating illustrations. So we had this big group of people, of professionals, who we came all together to try to make the story and involve so many different perspectives, and actually involve the people who are living every day the war and who know what it feels to actually hear air raids, and who have issues with internet, and we all strive to get past those challenges. The other films also for Oil in Our Creeks, the film about oil spill in Nigeria, we also work with local producers, local NGOs, local musicians, so this is our editorial strategy. And I cannot stress enough how important for us to not only tell stories about the communities, but with those communities. Because basically, for many people, the audience is just a story, but for those people, it's their life. And we should be very mindful about that. And when we work with those people, we want them to help us see things as they are. So it's different from the traditional fixing model. When you come to a place, you find a fixer who helps you facilitate your production, right? And he shows you what you want to see. So what we strive to do is that we see what they want us to see and what we need to see. So that's the difference. And also, this creates a very authentic, accurate representation of the issues we want to cover. And also diverse perspective. The next slide, it's very important for us, and you can see it from our team. It consists of mostly all women, and it's also, we are all from very diverse and international backgrounds. We have different approaches to many different things. And we think it's very important because when we are talking about mainstream global media, often it supports a white and male worldview. And we have this VR, which is a very new industry, and we are all just shaping it. So the way we approach stories and the way who creates those stories and the way we create the stories, it will shape what kind of stories we're gonna see with this medium, and we're gonna use this medium to tell those kind of stories.
Great. So I'll go next, and then
okay.
Geoffrey will be up. There we go. That's the one I wanted. So yeah, my name is Mark Ellison. I'm wearing two hats today as a panelist, but also a moderator. My day job is it's an odd thing. My day job is actually as a data journalist for the BBC, but I often am quite sad. I take my vacation time and unpaid leave to do projects internationally. I've regularly worked across the continent of Africa since 2011. My most recent project, which there's a photo of up on the screen there, was called House Without Windows. This project was set in the Central African Republic, and I set out to basically document how the ongoing conflict there specifically has impacted young children. The conflict effectively has been what I call an orphan factory. It's resulted in kids being orphaned, living on the streets. It's had a real impact on not only the health but the educational system. Many kids being forced to work, effectively forced into child labor, working in diamond mines and other things like that. There we go. Before I went out there, I thought, that from my own experience of working in the continent for a number of years, I know that there's a lot of reader fatigue around stories coming out of Africa. There's negative stereotypes about the continent, and so often people, I think, are turned off about reading stories coming out of the continent. And the media spotlight was only on the country really for the briefest of moments at the height of the violence back in 2013-14. So the challenge for me was, how do you try and re-engage an audience, back, on the continent, in the country, and how this conflict is impacting these young kids. And I was, conducting an interview with somebody from Doctors Without Borders, and I said, why do you think that Central African Republic doesn't have, say, as much media attention as, say, the Congo or South Sudan? And she shook her head and said, I don't really know why, but I essentially see the country as a house without windows. And what she meant by that was, without consistent, constant media attention, we, the outside, be it the global north, we couldn't see in and see what was happening. So I decided that I was going to use 360 to provide a virtual window into the house that is the Central African Republic, in an aim to transport the reader to an environment that they'll never ever likely go to, so that they could experience what things are like on the ground. We worked in the video. You can work alongside a child as they labour in a diamond mine. You can cycle around a refugee camp with an MSF worker, or you can experience what life is like living on the streets. So my hope is, this almost turns the viewer hopefully into a sort of armchair correspondent. It's going to hopefully engage, educate, and inform them. I just want to quickly show you just a clip from it. Hopefully. The pen is heavy, but the shovel is light. So goes the well-worn phrase that's whispered in the classrooms of Kano. Many parents here can't afford to send their kids to school in the southwest corner of the Central African Republic, so they are sent to the mines instead. After all, why go to school when you could become rich in a day? All that is needed is a little know-how, muscle, and luck. But Felix and Blaise, who are just 16 and 13, had no other choice. Their parents were killed by the Seleka, and they now have to fend for themselves. Day in and day out, they now dig and sieve for diamonds under a blazing sun. They found just one diamond in the last year, but still they dream of striking it rich. But for those children who do decide to go to school, there's no guarantee of a brighter future. Here in Wanu, over 60 kids crowd under a thatched roof. There are no computers, no textbooks, no stationery. And with a lack of professionally trained teachers in the country, village elders are called upon to become educators. Gaston used to be a truck driver for a diamond company, and he only went to primary school for a few years himself. And so as part of this project, so the video was launched in English and French on 5 of Huffington Post's international sites, along with an online graphic novel. The idea being, and actually I have a copy here, the idea being that the graphic novel is effectively a companion to the 360 video that serves to provide additional context and testimony. And embedded within the book as well are QR codes, so that you can be reading the book on a bus or at home, in the bath even, if you will, and you can scan the QR codes with your smartphone. And again, the idea is to try and transport you from a sort of 3D object to this immersive environment. And so, with the hope being that, accessing this through the smartphone, the tablet, the desktop computer, that, it allows us to provide thousands or millions of windows finally into the country that is Central African Republic. And I'll leave it there and hand it over to Geoffrey. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. My name is Geoffrey. I'm working for Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. I'm managing a small team of AV producer, and usually we produce photo, video, a bit of audio. And a few years ago, we saw the arrival of this new tool, 360. So for us, it's not, as Victoria, who has a very dedicated approach to this new medium, but it's something that we add to our toolbox. And of course, MSF is doing communication based on operations on the ground, and this very obviously and very often takes us to situations that are not very accessible for many people. So we have different approach to that. We try to give access to journalists, as you saw, as much as possible, but sometimes we also produce things ourselves for different purposes. Would it be advocacy, acceptance, or sometimes just visibility? And we discovered that 360 video or VR is a very interesting tool to take people to our realities, to the things that we see on the ground, and in a very different and much more immersive way. So I won't take too much time to talk about it, but also one of our principles as MSF is bearing witness, so it's showing what we see on the ground and being also kind of taking the voice of the patient that we work with outside. I have a small clip to show, showing different kind of a compilation of productions that we did in the last years, and then I'm very open to have this proper discussion and questions, and I'm sure it's going to be fun.
Which clip would you like first?
The demo reel. So it's only 2 minutes with different contexts. Mark, can you move on?
Sorry?
Can you make sure to turn around and? So as you see, we have done many different stuff, and also we used it to show to the people, but it's also a tool that we use sometimes for training. Before we send people in the field, we want them to really understand what they might face and to understand also this kind of situation from the inside, sometimes from the point of view also of a victim, as we did with the mass casualty exercise that we will talk about later. So yeah, that's it. And I don't know if I need to talk about the MSF now, but just to say that MSF has always used the media. It's an organization that have been also founded by doctors and journalists. So it's in our DNA since the beginning to to use media and also to use the new tools coming around that.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just going to start with just a really simple, basic question. I mean, as I said, 360 has been touted as the next new thing. I mean, as with drones and GoPro cameras and things like that. So, I mean, from your experience, I mean, do you think that 360 video really does evoke empathy, or is it just a gimmick? Anybody.
No, I think it's certainly not a gimmick, just a gimmick. As I said, I think it can be. I think, someone who takes it to a press conference, yeah, that's a gimmick. If you have 360 in here, that would be a gimmick. If used correctly, it's immensely powerful. But it has to be used at the right place, in the right time, in the right way. For me, I've said before, it's all about location. So the thing that I did that was most successful, that did best, was all about location. It was in a helicopter. We strapped it to the underside of an attack helicopter as it went over Mosul. Now, that isn't about empathy or poverty-born. That's just putting the viewer in an amazing location that there is no other way to go. And it's remarkable to watch. I might see if we can show a clip of that later, actually. But so in that case, definitely not a gimmick. But I think it can also be overplayed, the extent to which 360 is able to transform, people's opinions on things. And if you've seen the talk that Chris Milk gave, he talks about it as though this is unlike anything we've ever seen before, and anything we've ever done before, and that's just not true. The power of traditional video, sometimes, you see the stuff that's been done by correspondent small organizations over the years that has really changed people's view of the world. Traditional video has that power. 360 does as well, but not every time. I think it's very easy to think of this as something completely different, unlike anything we've done before, and I think it's not. It's just a different way to use pictures and sounds to tell a story. It can be amazingly effective, but it can be used badly.
Did you want to show a quick clip, or...?
Oh, let's have some more discussion first.
Okay, go for it.
Yes, I totally agree with Joe that we have to be very mindful how we use this medium. It's very powerful, but it has to be used correctly. Because it's not only about location, right? It shouldn't be just excitement for someone to see, wow, look how it would feel like to be in somewhere after the earthquake or something like that. It should be a story first and foremost. And what we do, we strive to have characters in those stories. So basically, you are traveling with someone who is living there and can tell you exactly how it feels to live there, and would actually give the power to that story and how they survive those things. So you wouldn't just be excited about being in that place, but you would understand better what issues are and how those people are living every day with those issues and how they're struggling and how they're finding solutions. So that's very interesting, and that's what we always strive to do.
Yeah, I agree on that. Just to give an example, I'm sure many of you have seen a lot of images about migration roads in Europe, and I had the experience a few times. We did a production on migration in 360 and took it to some events, some theater play, after the theater play, whatever, and people try it, and after that they say, "Oh, thanks a lot," because I've seen these images a lot of times, but now I understand it from another point of view. I really understand it from the inside. I mean, you saw these images of it's the Serbian border, I think. When you are inside the headset with that, it's quite powerful, to the point that sometimes it can be very traumatic. This is something that we approach also beforehand, is that I had the experience of a production, and I was showing it to one of my colleagues, an experienced field worker with MSF, someone who have been in very difficult places. I gave him the headset, not telling him exactly what was coming, but we had discussed about the project beforehand. And then he took it off, and he was very mad at me. He told me, "Are you crazy to give it to me like this? You should have prepared me. You should have told me, what is this?" It takes me back to very difficult times that I had to go through. And to the point that after that, now we are thinking twice when we show something. And the next production that have been done by MSF after that, there was a whole work of preparing and like briefing and debriefing the people before they watch it. So this production is not something that you can find online. It's something that has been used for advocacy purposes, to specific going to decision makers. But basically, they have worked with a psychologist to determine a kind of a process before you watch it, how to get prepared, and after you watch it, how was it and how do you feel? Because I don't know, I'm sure you had this experience showing 360 and you have people in tears afterwards because it's very intense.
Well, I think actually you allude there to something which is a really, really important point, and I'm sure we'll come back to, is the fundamental difference between the experience of watching a 360 film as you see there, and if you watch on a desktop, or it's interesting, and you go, oh, this is amazing, interesting, I can look around. The difference between that as an experience and watching on a headset, they're incomparable. And I think that is something that is, and especially from a broadcasting point of view, we know that for the most part, we're not taking it to someone, putting it on their head and saying, here, watch that. We have to stick it out on YouTube, stick it out on a site, and we assume that most people are going to be watching it just on a desktop or maybe on their phone. And that's a very, very different experience to the headsets. And I think, actually, as we say, we're having a thing afterwards. So it is worth, if you haven't done it, it's worth going and seeing it up close because it's completely, completely transformative.
And I want to add to that because that's exactly happened with one of our films. So when we're talking that not all the stories work in 360, some of them really do. And what happened with our film, Forced to Flee, which we filmed in Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, it was really... and we even talked about it in the team, how actually 360 showed better the scale of the crisis and how many people are there and how packed are the camps and how muddy are the roads and all these kind of things. So maybe let's see the clip, like a short clip from that film, Forced to Flee. Just a couple of shots.
بس بقول أنا سأقول لك كده إنه كقريبة قاعد يخطون قاعد دهون قريش دي.
ويرى هورين إترا الدكتور بعد زورون غوري بعد إترا زيرون دشون درجة ملتين هم بيكون زورون جد. عرض شما ده عرض منزين من هم جد. تقول قرادي عرض فوق ده زت فريقة بڑا زت مري ما حد ولا يتاكل حد ولا.
And we partnered to do this film with Amnesty International, and we brought this film actually physically, as Joe was talking, with the headsets to the UN Security Council, and we showed this to some UN Security Council members. And they really said that it actually gave them additional and deeper understanding of the issue. And the Polish representative said that it was very powerful material. It's one thing to hear about it, and it's another thing to see it with your own eyes. So actually, that's how he felt, and I think that shows how powerful it can be. Because especially in this in these times when we have so many news coming out, we read everything bits and pieces on Twitter or something. This can give us a better understanding, deeper understanding of the issues that that are happening in the world.
And I mean, I just want to ask you guys, do you think that this medium has maybe been different to other medium in the sense of trying to change people's minds about particular events? I mean, I know that people maybe who have been sort of right-wingers who have been critical about the refugee crisis, what's going on in Bangladesh, people, for example, who maybe vote UKIP and read the Daily Mail. I don't know, do you find that, if them being transported, that has actually maybe changed people's viewpoints? I don't know if you measure analytics or, clicks or how long people stay with the story that suggests engagement?
This is entirely unscientific, obviously, but so the 360 I showed the first clip of, which is, immersive 360 on a migrant boat, and you see people there, and they are telling the most appalling stories, you know, there are people with marks of torture on their back, and it's really terrible things. And we had to switch comments off because it certainly didn't seem from what people were saying underneath that it was engendering empathy. Which is a sad thing to have to admit, but it's true. And I know there are issues around. We're probably doing it towards the end of the. You know, there'd been a lot of coverage for a long time about the migrant crisis in Europe, and I know through discussions with people at MSF, it's a difficult issue, the use of the boats in the Mediterranean. But we didn't find there was that much, you know, empathy coming through.
If it was that simple. No, of course not. It's not a magic tool, but it's one element amongst other to start the discussion and to make people think and understand a bit better situation that very often they don't really know, they don't really understand, and they think this is the answer I should give to it, but actually they don't know what they are talking about. So it's an additional tool, as I said before, to broaden the discussion.
Victoria, did you have anything to add on that?
No, I agree with the point.
Well, actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but literally just a couple of weeks ago, the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism published a paper that was written by Dan Archer and Katharina Finger in March, actually. So it was basically a survey of 180 people. They were given a number of different clips to watch, and then this academic paper was based on that sort of questionnaire. So one of the key findings, and this is sort of riffing off the idea of vicarious trauma and what to show, what not to show in a sensitive manner, they found or suggested that be cautious about showing too many scenes that can cause viewer discomfort. Scenes of harsh conditions and suffering can drastically affect user comfort and enjoyment, triggering disengagement from the material and contributing to a drop in long-term memory recall and engagement. We recommend interspersing such scenes with less charged and more neutral material to counterbalance the effect. So, I mean, I don't know what you guys think about that. I mean, if you're trying to show the scale of the problem in Bangladesh, I mean, I can see what they're saying, that on the one hand, you want to do it in a tasteful way, but on the other hand, you know, as journalists, as filmmakers, we want to basically show how shitty the situation is. So, do you agree with this statement? I mean, in terms of trying to get that, and well, how do you get that balance?
I think the most important is to remember, even if we're doing virtual reality or we're using these advanced technologies, we're still, first and foremost, we're journalists, right? And the ethics of journalism, that's what's the most important. So I think vetting what kind of shots should go where, it comes from our understanding as journalists. So I don't see it as very different from what discussions we would have whether to show it on the screen. Of course, you have to think that it could be more powerful and it could actually cause trauma for some people even more when you show it on the headset. But there are also different ways. You can, for example, you can create different versions that you post on Facebook or you post on a headset. You know, you can think, because this is more technical thing, but for example, when we do different versions for our social media and headsets, we think about some moving shots. They really cause nausea for people, so we change those. So, you know, you should have these discussions, we should have these discussions, but I think it just comes from the same place as any other discussion in journalism.
I mean, to agree with you, I think that exact sentence could have been written about, you know, the conversations you have, you know, for a traditional news piece. I mean, we make decisions about the showing of, I mean, we don't, for example, I don't know what your policy is, BBC doesn't show moment of death, there's just a blanket policy, we don't show that moment. And if you're going to show a dead body, it's done very lightly, very, very carefully and with great judgment. It's very easy to think, it's a new medium, everything's new. It's not, it's good, traditional, editorial, journalistic judgment.
Yeah, I agree, and also we don't have to always show misery. You can also show positive story, like with any other media. And one of our most used 360 video is actually basically a visit of a field hospital in Central African Republic that we take to the street to show the people a bit the way we use the money that we collect. And so it's very, there's nothing like misery or whatever. It's a positive story of a woman giving birth, and you go to the hospital with the doctor to understand a bit how they work, what is the reality in the field, and how the support of MSF has improved their daily life. So it depends also. I mean, there are different ways of telling stories. Of course, sometimes you need to show bad or difficult stuff, but not all the time.
I mean, on that note, I mean, as a charitable organization, you know, one could understand the need, well, or the desire to potentially use this sort of powerful medium to try and increase donations, for example. So, I mean, how do you mitigate that? How are you conscious of that? Obviously, you want people to donate, but at the same time, you don't want to, you know, manipulate people necessarily. But so I mean, I don't know. Is that something that you're conscious of?
I was a bit expecting that kind of question, to be honest.
I figured I'd get it in there in case somebody out there asked.
No, of course, it's, as I said before, it's another medium, but it's the same problem with, would it be photo exhibition or video on TV? So it's always a balance to find. We have for principles to always talk about what we see on the ground, and we also have very strict ethical guidelines. We work with professionals, people, you know, and to be honest, yes, we've used some images to raise some money. That's true. But not whatever images. There's a whole filter between the images that we receive from the ground and the one that we actually distribute. And so we are very careful about what we do with this content. And for example, the policy that we have in terms of consent, etc., is very strict, and is getting even more stricter with the GDPR regulation that is coming soon. And we are not a media organization. We are a humanitarian organization. Our goal is different. Our goal is to protect the people, is to protect the patient that we work with, and so sometimes we just drop the camera on the floor and help them. Or, you know, what I mean is, we don't have. If we have to choose between a very nice shot and protecting the patient, the choice is done, and this is something that we are very clear about. So yes, we've used some images to go in the street and to show the people the reality that we are facing, but not whatever images. There's a whole process of selection and very strict guidelines and barriers about that.
And I'm curious, I mean, you don't necessarily have to name names, but have you seen any examples of 360 out there where you thought, you know, that's overwrought, or that is poverty porn 2.0? Just to put you on the spot.
To be honest, I don't have 360 in mind. But in photography, yes. But I will not name anyone. They will recognize themselves, I'm sure.
Victoria, Joe, same question?
No.
Yeah. Again, I can't in 360. As again, I can in traditional media. I mean, this come to the point I made before. You stick a 400mm telephoto lens on the front of your camera. You can get some really quite exploitative, intimate images, far more so than you do from a camera which is essentially a couple of super wide-angle lenses or 6 super wide-angle lenses bolted together. You know, you could stick one here and my face would be in the distance. You can use one of these, use a big broadcast camera and I can get a close-up of anyone in this room. It's actually much easier to get an exploitative image with a traditional media.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. One freelancer who has been working with us, she's a photographer in Sierra Leone. So I found her through online, and I trained her how to do 360 because I wanted to do one story from Sierra Leone. And she got really excited about this medium, and she said that actually she felt while doing the story and when seeing the results, she felt like it was even more honest for her, because she said, I needed maybe like 5 or more photos to actually show what's the situation. And also, as you were saying, with the photos, you can crop something out, you know, with video as well, you choose like specific cuts. And with 360, it's much more difficult. It's basically what's out there, that's what you see, you know? So that's what her, was her that's what she saw when she moved or tried a new medium, and she's photojournalism based. Yeah.
Do you think that we could say that before we were framing with a camera, you know, you can really frame something, and now the frame is actually the distance where you put the camera. That's how you somehow frame it, and would you put the camera here or over there to see the whole crowd? I think this also can be a kind of framing.
I mean, definitely, but you would still see what's happening behind. You cannot hide that, you know? So there are things that actually this medium brings.
And I'm curious, Victoria, so, you know, you, as we've seen, you often work with local journalists or local filmmakers. Have you found that they do approach a story differently in terms of how they shoot and what they shoot? In 360?
Mm-hmm. No, I really don't think so. I think, again, like, these are just journalists, like really strong journalists that we work with, and they find this new medium that they can actually tell the stories in that new medium. So for them, it's just challenging. Of course, it's challenging to hide from the shot, right? Or not be able to be with a character closer. Like you just basically have to be behind the scenes more than we're used to as journalists if you're a photographer or you're a filmmaker, right? But I think the stories, they just found that, you know, there is a different way to tell stories, and then they can do maybe different stories that they never thought of, you know, that maybe 360 makes it more powerful stories, more impactful stories.
And actually a question for Joe and Geoffrey. So I know that you've both, and this could equally apply actually to the camps in Bangladesh, but in terms of working and doing the films about refugees on the boats in the Mediterranean, in terms of informed consent, I mean, obviously you're capturing tens, dozens, hundreds of people. Presumably you don't get consent from every single person there, so ethically, how do you approach that?
It is a genuinely problematic issue. We get, in this case, MSF staff to let everyone know it's happening. And it is a difficult one. I mean, the main, actually, kind of the way you get around it is about for the most part, people in the distance, you can't see people's faces. People are relatively, unless you get up close, people are anonymous. And so what you do is that you make sure that if you're going to feature someone close up, you get their consent. So there's a scene in the film where there's a guy walking, holding giving out the food. And we obviously get him, and you use a section where you make sure those people there have said yes. But it's difficult. It really is. If you're in, in the refugee camp, there's no way you can say to 100,000 people who are there. I mean, the other thing that you just do to people is if there are people around, you just say, if you don't want to be on the camera, we're only filming for 30 seconds, turn your head the other way, and people's faces are gone. But it is probably, I would argue, it's the big ethical challenge around 360 filming.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add on that. It's exactly the same, but it's true that consent is always a big issue. What we try to do is that as soon as we, kind of focus on a proper one main character, then we are very, very cautious about making sure that you have a proper informed consent, and we take time to do it. And hopefully we have the support of local translator, else promoter, things like this. And also in some specific situation, like a stigma situation with HIV, with Ebola, we are very, very strict with that. And so there's a lot of limitations, and very often when we have freelancers or media coming, they are very frustrated with us because I'm sorry, but we cannot do that, we cannot shoot that, and it can be very, very frustrating. I'm sure you.
I was going to say, as someone who's worked with MSF on the boat, they are very, very strict. Not overly so, but and actually to agree with what Geoffrey was saying before, and just to kind of reinforce your point, I'm told when I'm on the boat, if I am told that I'm needed to do something, if there's a mass casualty, I drop my camera, even though I'm a journalist. Even the journalists are told, if we need you, even if it's just for lifting stuff, you drop your camera and you work. And it never happened, and it's a difficult point, but that is the rules they make.
And just to add about the boat itself, I've been on the very first trip, and my role was exactly that. It was to see what was possible or not, to what extent we can take externals or not, and to draft kind of a guidelines. And at the beginning, we tried not to show images of the rescuer themselves, but at some point it was necessary, and we had to find a balance between what we can show or not. But it was necessary to show what was actually happening there, because it was a nightmare for us. And it still is, actually.
Yeah. I want to add as well. I think what's important to understand also that with 360, we document not only the main character, but also the entire community. So the necessity of high quality, honest reporting is even greater. And we have to always think that this film is going to represent the community. And talking about the consent, yes, it's impossible to get consent from everyone. But what our job entails most of the time, because of that, it entails a lot of explanation and explaining to the people, to the characters, to the people who are around. So basically, we try to do as much as possible and answering the questions honestly. If somebody asks, what is this medium, how it's being done, we definitely take time to explain how this works and how they will appear in this film, and do they want to be, these conversations are very important to have.
And maybe if I can, I would like to know in this room who have ever experienced 360 headset. Can you raise your hand if you tried it once?
Ooh.
So It's even not half of them, and we are supposed to be in a, maybe not exactly representative population of journalists or interested in journalists. So that shows that another challenge that we have is when we go and filming in the field, one of the first things, if you work with some specific people, some specific character, you have to make them experience. Otherwise, they don't understand what is these little balls that you are using. Most of the people, they know what is a television. They know what is a photo, what is the radio, but they don't know what is 360. So you have to really take it to them and make them experience. Maybe
well,
you can.
I was going to say, just on that note, that the reason I've just pulled up this photo is there was a funny story behind this photo that, I was collaborating with this local community in this, where they had this big open cast artisanal diamond mine. And I collaborated, I'd gone and see the community chief, and he said, yes, it's fine for you to shoot and interview the kids working in the mine. And so everybody knew, who I was, what I was doing, and yet I sort of set up the camera and started shooting, and I could tell that there was some disquiet, some unhappiness amongst the people working in the mine. So I said to my translator, I said, do you mind just finding out? I get the sense that all's not well. And he came back to me and he says, they think that I just use a Ricoh Theta. They think that your camera is like an ultrasound device, that you're here from a foreign mining company, that you're actually here trying to sort of find if there are diamonds here and where they are, that effectively you're going to steal their diamonds. So even despite community engagement and trying to tell them what it was I was doing, I ended up having one of the boys put on the headset, and I just shot some test footage from a Scottish park. And so this is just a photo of him immersed in a Scottish park, which was, I think, quite bizarre for him. But just to show that even if you do engage with the community and you're trying to exactly inform them about what it is you're doing, it doesn't always work. So on that note, I'm aware that we've got 20 minutes left, and so true to my word, I want to try and open it up to questions. So fire away. Yes.
I'm really interested I'm interested to hear more about how you're working with characters within documentary process within 360. Because one of the things that's going through my mind is the distance that a super wide angle creates. I know what you're saying about big, juicy, exploitative close-ups, but at the same time, I do a lot of live work, and one of the most powerful things is when people talk to the camera, because they have control and agency because they're talking live. I may be asking questions, but there's an immediacy there. So I was wondering about the agency of the subjects that you're interviewing and what the differences are between conventional video and the challenges, and how you problem solve so that your subjects are empowered rather than being disempowered.
I think that's a great question, Victoria.
Yeah, sure. So what we do is we actually ask them to answer the questions so we do normally audio interviews, so we base the narration on that, right? But then we tell them, you have something to tell. You want to tell the story. Tell it to the camera as if you're telling someone who will watch you. So we're trying to create this connection between the viewer and the character. So of course it needs to, again, explanation what it is, how someone will see you. But I think it's again brings this very interesting aspect that the viewer can actually look eye to eye with the subject, and the subject is not someone telling the story to someone, but telling the story to you. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting aspect, and I think the people really, they feel like they're telling the message. They sometimes even start with that, my message to the world, or my message to someone who is watching this is that and that. And I think it's what they can actually say what they want, and we are not even around. So sometimes it's a very, it's the personal experience of the character who can tell the story to someone who will be watching, straight looking into the eye.
I think my experience has been being realistic about it. Unless you happen to get a subject who is able to deliver, a really compelling the script of a really compelling 5-minute video just off the cuff to the camera like that, which I've personally never come across, you need to have edited audio, especially if it's because you I mean, and that is very difficult, because if someone is speaking, talking to the camera, you can't edit it because it'll look jumpy. You need to have a single continuous shot. So what I've done in the past, and I've seen a lot of people do, is essentially do an audio interview, sit into a radio interview somewhere else, and you can get all of the material you need to allow you, so you can then subsequently edit it together so that person is telling their story, but they're telling it in a way that is concise and keeps the viewer engaged. And the way you get around that by still maintaining that engagement with the viewer is that you quite often see this, is a shot, an opening shot and an establishing shot, which is in your central location. It's just them eyeballing the camera, and they're there kind of just looking, and you'll have that as your opening shot. So you do get that feeling that the person is telling their story, because it's their voice and it's their face and you can see their eyes, but you're not having, you know, just someone's, no, I don't know how, some people might be excellent, but generally not that coherent or not that concise opening thought. Or you don't have them staring, you can have them acting, but you combine those two things, and I think you get probably a decent kind of combination of them telling their story and it being concise.
Yeah, maybe I recommend that you watch a VR experience called The Enemy, when you are between actually two people from two different, let's say, world, two different point of view, and they are talking to each other. Would it be an Israeli soldier and a Palestinian? And it's quite interesting, because you are in between four eyes and can watch one another, and you can turn around, they are there and you're in the middle, and it's very interesting to watch. So that's a good example of things you can do that is a bit unusual, but it's an interesting experience.
Great. Any other questions? So, lady just here in the second row.
Do you think that a 360 in this context could be a form of infotainment, like entertainment, bringing together the entertainment experience plus the information? Because I saw a lot of videos and I don't think there is a lot of empathy actually, and even the user behavior is not, there is no interaction sometimes like other videos. So any danger of infotainment to bring together stories, serious stories and issues with a form of entertainment?
Well, so I was just going to say, I mean, in terms of you talking about, you didn't feel maybe engaged with some of the clips. I mean, I guess granted, these are just clips, and I certainly invite you to wear one of the headsets afterwards, because I know from sort of testing on family guinea pigs, not literally guinea pigs, but family members, that would be strange. That it's completely, watching it on desktop versus watching it in the headset is a completely different experience. And you know, a whole bunch of studies have been written on that to say that effect. I mean, just as a bit of a segue, I should also say that, I mean, you're talking about infotainment. I know that 360 is even being used in the porn industry. Don't ask me how I know, but apparently this is the case. Anyway, moving on. I don't know if you guys would like to.
I'll get you out of this one. No, it's interesting you say that, because that is one of the criticisms of the helicopter thing I did. It got, you know, some people thought, you know, amazing, you can see this, I properly understand it, and I went out of my way to make the commentary as neutral as possible. It was almost like a guided tour of the city, showing people what the landmarks were, but still, and it was really, I was deliberately flat in my commentary. Still, one of the repeated criticisms that people said is, you're making this look like a computer game. You're trying to make this makes it, you know, make this look entertaining, and it's obviously what I wanted to say, although it's difficult to say. I'm not making it look like a computer game. Computer games have been made to look like this. This is simply a completely honest and total picture of what it is actually like to be, you know, underneath the wing of this helicopter. I'm not making it look like entertainment. It's just that entertainment has become so much like the real world. So yes, you're right, but my answer is, it's not that we're looking like computer games. It's that we're finally showing people the real world which computer games have been modelled on for so long. In fact, is it now? Can you show a little clip of that? Just if there's a minute. Is there not time?
Yeah, maybe if...
Oh, no.
Yeah. Never mind. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just one thing is that it can be a bit true. I mean, if you go to the street with some pictures, with some photo, or with a TV, with some videos, no one will really stop. If you go with these headsets, they will stop. They want to try it. So, in some point, there is a kind of attractivity from this new tool. But then, if that helps you to take your message and to take what you really want to say to the people, and for them to understand and to really watch it, then it works for me. It's worth it. Then what's inside, I really encourage you to try it afterwards, and I'm sure you will change your mind, because it's
not my opinion, I'm speaking about users.
Yeah, all right, all right.
It is a very fair point.
Okay, another question.
Thank you. I'm just curious, really, as to whether you think that this kind of new 360 video will ever get to a point where it kind of takes over from like traditional media, or whether you think they're two things that tell different stories in different ways. Just really curious.
Yeah, very shortly. I always say, let the Facebook founders tell that it's the future, and we will gonna see if it's the future. But I think it's just another way of telling the stories, and traditional media is not going to disappear anytime soon, because it has a different function. Because when it's a breaking news story, we all turn on TV and we all, you know, go to like breaking news BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera to actually see what's going on. I know, right? Just being very kind.
Well, I was going to say, I'd just like to interject there as well, and I'm a great believer that just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So I wouldn't use 360 for every project. I've done lots of graphic novel projects, and that medium is great, but it doesn't work for every single project. So you really have to think of, when drones first came out, everybody and their dog was using drones. I've seen some terrible examples of 360 where people are just sat in a really bland office doing an interview, one-on-one interview, and they're using 360. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And then it gives 360 filmmakers a sort of, it gives them a harder task to then try and say, hey, watch my really cool 360 project about a refugee crisis. And they'll think, oh, no, I'd rather not.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, and I think the short answer is no. The long answer is, so my primary job is going out and doing traditional 16:9 or digital filmmaking. My ambition is to try and do 2 360s a year. I think that's basically and that's, I think, is ambitious, because I think for the vast majority of stories, it's not the most effective way to tell them, but for some stories, it's far and away the best. So it's part of a mixed economy of storytelling.
Same here, and just to add that this is a very, even if it's not new anymore, it's really the early ages, and the grammar is not developed, and even the technology is evolving a lot. Now we are filming in 4K, but 6K and 8K is coming, so there will be a possibility to zoom in the image. I mean, it's just the beginning, so it's a bit early to say how it will evolve, but if you look at the big players, they are investing a lot in the technology, so I suppose it's going to be there for a few years at least.
Yeah, I think at this point I would say that it's gonna stay. It's just a matter of what kind of stories we're gonna tell in that way, and maybe some other technology will appear. Maybe we're gonna have AR stories or mixed reality stories, right? Like everyday seeing stories like that. But I don't think any of these technologies will just. We're not, at least not in the upcoming 10 years. We're not that it's the only way we're gonna watch everything. So definitely not. But I think it's here to stay. This medium definitely.
Any other questions? Maybe can we take...
I've got a question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm over here. I've had the microphone for a while. I was wondering, as a journalist, when your main job is to go out and tell the story you need to tell in the best way possible, you've partially answered this question already, but how often does it actually come up that you can use 360? Or do you find yourself choosing stories that you maybe wouldn't have originally considered because you see, oh, this is an opportunity to use 360?
I would do, yeah. If there was something that came up and I was like, oh my God, I could do an amazing 360 on that, then yes, I would just go and do it. I'd probably go and film it normally as well, but I would do a 360 specific deployment. But no, in general, I think, okay, it's all, and this is actually different. So Victoria is part of a team that does just 360, and you can go and put days and days and days into it, and you come up with an amazing product, as you can see. Whereas for me, I have to do it as part, so I will go out, I'll be shooting and editing and working with one of our languages correspondent and doing that at the same time. So in that shot, you could see in the 360, I'm actually holding the camera next to it and doing 360 at the same time. So you have to be quite specific about the times you do it, because otherwise you end up with something rubbish. I think it's, yeah, I would, obviously, being kind of making a broad statement, a couple of times a year, and I might go and do, 15 big deployments, and I'll use it on a couple of them.
And I mean, I'm typically the same. I mean, I'll have a particular project in mind, thinking this is going to make for a great 360. That having been said, though, again, I just use the Ricoh Theta V, which is a great little camera. It's smaller than an iPhone. It fits in your backpack, and as long as you've got a tripod, then if you are out in the field and you think, you know what, I could get some good 360 clips here, then away you go. It's click and play. It stitches in camera. Spatial audio, all that good stuff. I don't have any Theta shares, I swear, but so it's part of that sort of Mojo kit that I think that you have. That you'll have your DSLR, you have your little 360 camera as well, and so you can do stuff on the fly if need be. Do you guys have anything to add to that? No. Okay, any more questions?
I have a question for Victoria first. How and where did you train Manal and Ahmed? Did you train them in Lebanon? And did you train them also to answer if Houthis will question them? Because I'm saying as a person who works in Yemen, and due to my double nationality, we really risk a lot to be in jailed. And when militias, they come to us, even though we have an iPhone. And third question, did you train them also how to take care of their equipment? Because we used to have problems even before the war, just for our Mac, how to repair them, and it was necessary to send them to Dubai. So I just was wondering about that.
Yeah, so the process was quite long. UNESCO helped us to bring the cameras to the journalists. And UNESCO helped us choose the journalists that they thought that were really strong, and we then started the communication with those journalists to see whether we should work together, right? So they got the cameras in Jordan, and then they brought the cameras back home to Yemen. The way the whole process worked, it was really long, and the internet was very poor, so we used WhatsApp messages and WhatsApp voice notes. So basically not being even able to communicate normally was such a challenge. So they would always send us back some footage, we would send them back the notes, and they would go back and forth. So it took us 4 months to create the documentary that we have now. In terms of, more the situation in Yemen, I mean, these journalists, this is what the stories they wanted to tell. So we asked them, actually, they pitched the stories, what they wanted to tell, right? So we didn't approach them saying, oh, we want to do about airstrikes, find something. They actually told us that this is what they want to show, and this is their message to the world. So I know Ahmed really had issues as well, and it was difficult for him. It's all these permits. It was really complicated. Also, he said people were really not trusting media. It was a really big challenge, and especially when you come with this 360, which nobody understands even more, and it was really challenging. But yeah, but I think we did the best we could, and we're really proud of the work they've done, the journalists themselves, and it wouldn't have been possible without them. Yeah.
Okay, I think we maybe can try and squeeze in a couple more questions.
No time.
Sorry?
No time.
Oh, no time? Oh, we don't have 5 more minutes?
No, because we have another panel.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up then. So just a quick, I've been told. So just a quick reminder, we're going to be outside for about the next half an hour with our little informal VR pop-up. So please come out and experience these films with us, or if you just got general questions about software, hardware, that kind of thing. Thanks very much, and thank you to my fellow panel members.
Sorry, I'm doing a very, very shameless plug. My 360 film is up for a Webby, and I've got to win a popularity vote against David Attenborough, which I'm clearly going to lose. But if you can go onto the Webbies and vote for Best 360 Film, it'd be really appreciated. Sorry, that's really shameless.
Great. Thanks very much, guys. And again, thanks to the panel.
I'm going to lose, but I might as well lose trying.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily from the Membership Puzzle Project. It's so nice to see so many wonderful, good-looking faces here in Perugia. This is basically paradise. What I would like to do is to set up a little bit about Membership Puzzle Project and some of our research findings that I think will be beneficial to those of you in the room. Then I will introduce my esteemed panelists who are part of our research affiliate program. And then we're just going to open up for a discussion amongst the panel and then leave time for your questions. Does that sound good? Great. So, Membership Puzzle Project is an initiative out of New York University Journalism School to understand how news sites might be better optimized for trust. So one of our hypotheses, in collaboration with our funders, Knight Foundation and the Democracy Fund, is that membership in its most robust forms is a great way to create sustainability for news, both in terms of long-term engagement and a sense of belonging, and also revenue. So we really think about audience development and engagement and audience revenue as two sides of the same coin, that you can't have one without the other. I want to make a quick distinction about some of what we'll be talking about as a group here today, in that our project differentiates between subscription, donation, and membership. And a fair amount of this information is on our site. We are a project in the public interest, and so would encourage you to share the questions that you have for us. But just a little bit of table setting is that we think of subscription as a product-based transaction. I give the New Yorker $100 US or so a year. They give me digital access and a copy of their magazine in my mailbox each week. The exchange starts and ends there. And that is a wonderful way of doing business for many, many news organizations. Where our project is really fascinated is around membership that looks more like a cause-based exchange, where you participate in something because you believe in it, and you're part of a social contract. So our research is heavily focused around what is given and received on both sides, with a particular attention to ways that people can pay in participation. So the idea that, yes, monetary giving is absolutely essential, but there are lots of other ways that your readers, listeners, and viewers might help the work that you do by participating in the journalism, whether that be as technical proofreaders, as comment moderators, as event volunteers, event programmers, as fact checkers, and many, many more ways of engaging in really robust knowledge exchange in two directions. And the two directions piece is really crucial, and this is what you'll hear from the panelists today, that this isn't just journalism in which the audience is engaged to interact at the point of publication and then asked to distribute the work. Many of these sites are really thinking about how can we engage the audiences we want to reach from the very beginning of our publication processes to create work that really is much more involving and reflective of the communities that they aim to serve. As part of this work, our project has gone around the world, and these are some of the supporters of the sites of the esteemed people you see here, and we've asked the question of them, what are the things that you value in the independent news that you choose to support with your time, energy, money, and ideas? And we've heard really high consistency in the things that people say that they value. So we'll go clockwise here. And this really comes out of questions about, you know, for news and the organizations you support beyond it, what really drives your decision to give and to be part of an organization, to affiliate yourself with it, and to be involved in substantive ways? The first thing that we hear is the importance of transparency. Pull back the curtain and demystify your work. Make it clear to your supporters where their money goes, how you make hiring decisions, how you make editorial decisions. We find that so much of this really is sort of a black box, even for professional people who are longtime supporters of news. Next, we hear a lot about the importance of a sense of uniqueness, and this is something that all of these sites do fantastically well, to offer coverage that their audience members can't find anywhere else, whether it's because their reporters have deep expertise in those subject areas, because other area publications have backed off from that coverage, or many, many more reasons. We hear a lot about the importance of a user experience that doesn't take advantage of people's attention. So a site or a mobile app where they can come and really get immersed in the news, understand complex topics, and not be bombarded with slow-to-load pages, pop-up ads, and other disruptive experiences. We also hear a lot about the importance of a financial ask that literally makes sense. And I wish I could tell you what that amount should be or what the right thing to ask for on a monthly or annual basis is for the sites that you work for. But I would say that going directly to your supporters to ask these questions will go much further. So really developing a fascination with their price considerations, the way that they use your news products, and their points of dissatisfaction with mainstream news will really help you identify pricing strategies moving forward. And then finally, offering the world something that I think should exist. We hear this over and over again, the idea that even if an individual supporter of news doesn't visit your site 3 times a day, they still believe that it's a civic good and something that they want to see exist in the world. We hear a lot about this, the educational and the information role that journalists play in our societies, and I just want to echo that back to you because that is so fantastically important to hear, that the work that you're doing really does matter day in and day out to the people you're trying to reach. Similarly, we hear a great deal about the things that people get less value out of than I certainly expected in undertaking this work. So the first thing that we hear is branded merchandise as a benefit is something that they care about not a lot, if at all. 9 times out of 10, supporters of independent news will tell us they would rather have the money go back into the journalism as opposed to getting a tote bag or a sweatshirt with your site's name on it. And then very encouragingly, we also hear that supporters of independent news around the world really want access to the core news products they support to remain free. So that means, where possible, removing or not implementing paywalls in the first place so that more people can access the work. This is not to say that members-only benefits like members' newsletters or early access to events and the like aren't additive. Those play an important role in sort of moving the needle, especially for people who are first-time supporters. But the importance of creating an inclusive experience rather than an exclusive one is one that we hear over and over again. So with some of that background, about 4 months ago, we launched a research affiliate program with audience-facing staff at sites around the world who told us they could benefit from a professional community around membership and news. And this absolutely comes out of studying what works with other networks, such as the News Revenue Hub and the Institute for Nonprofit News in the US. We wanted to create a community of publishers who are open-minded but distinct in their coverage and also at different points in their audience engagement and membership programs. And so, without further ado, I'll introduce 4 of the 5. There's one other site, which is the US education site Chalkbeat, which is also a part of this cohort. Directly to my left, I have Natalie Choate, Director of Media Relations and Partnerships for the Texas Tribune. The Tribune is a member-supported, nonpartisan newsroom headquartered in Austin, Texas, focusing on informing Texans about public policy, politics, and government news. And some of the work that we'll be talking about today comes from Rebecca Quarles, formerly of the Tribune and now with the News Revenue Hub. Next, we have Jessica Best, operations lead for The Correspondent. And The Correspondent comes out of Day Correspondent, a member-funded Dutch news site that focuses on context and insightful context rather than the daily news cycle, and that's something that we're going to talk about in our time here today. The Correspondent, the English language site, is forthcoming, and Micah Goslinga, who unfortunately can't be here, also contributed to the work that you'll hear. Next, we have Andrea Hart, Director of Community Engagement for City Bureau, which is a civic journalism lab based on the south side of Chicago, focusing on equitable local media coverage and civic participation. And finally, Damien Osta, co-founder and CEO of La Diaria, an independent newspaper headquartered in Montevideo, Uruguay, organized as a workers' cooperative and focused on civic and organizational transparency. Each of these sites has a different model. As you heard, La Diaria is a co-op. Other sites in this cohort are for-profit or nonprofit. And so the first question that I wanted to bring to the panel today is, why membership? Because this isn't just something that is a revenue strategy. For many of them, it can be a very effective part of how they fundraise. But it goes well beyond that. And so actually, I'm going to kick it off to Andrea to talk about why do you embark on this in the first place?
Totally. Yeah, so it's as much a financial decision as it is a political one. So the city of Chicago is incredibly diverse, but also incredibly segregated. And I think it's funny that City Bureau hosted its first fundraiser the day that DNA Info shut down. And so DNA Info was a hyperlocal news site catered to neighborhoods throughout the city of Chicago, but it was funded by the Ricketts, Joe Ricketts, I forget which one, but a wealthy family, so single founder, single funder, and that to us was like very problematic. And we actively have talked about how do we diversify our newsroom, and the flip side of that same coin is like how do you diversify your funding strategy, because we are accountable to, we are very much unapologetically localized and hyperlocal and place-based, and so in doing that, part of that means like we are accountable to our local folks, but also that we provide a value that they pay for. And so we want our funder base to look like our newsroom, to look like our workshops, to look like all of the programming that we do, because that means that we have reached the right amount of people who now invest in what we're doing. And so it's very much, so when we think about membership, it's a political act as much as it is like a long-term sustainable financial plan.
Yeah, for The Correspondent, it came out of the way we were founded. Our founder, Rob Weinberg, founded The Correspondent when he was fired from one of the major Dutch newspapers, NRC Next, because he essentially believed that news or the news cycle is uninteresting. What's really interesting is structures and the forces that shape our world, and that's the sort of journalism we should be doing. But what he found was that sort of legacy publishers or traditional publishers weren't that interested in supporting this kind of work because actually they're supported by advertising, and advertising doesn't support that kind of work because you're chasing clicks, you're chasing numbers. So this belief that kind of the news or the breaking news isn't interesting and that we wanted to be ad-free meant that membership really made sense for The Correspondent. And the other thing that we really feel is that membership goes right to the center of the trust relationship. We feel it helps us to address the trust crisis in that our members are invested in what we do. We listen really closely to what they want and what they need from us. And we're able to do that because we're sustained by them. And that really helps to build a relationship. We're not trying to sell them to anyone else.
I think for the Texas Tribune, membership has always been part of what we do. It was baked into the cake when we first got started. It was a very important aspect of our mission. We believe that engaging and educating Texans will make for a better Texas. And so membership has been the core of that. We also prioritize members because we know that they're ambassadors for the work that we do, and that they lay their name on the line when they talk about our work, and so it makes sense that we would invest in them. There's also a community aspect to membership. We know that they value our work and that we want to foster that community. So in addition to being a revenue opportunity, they're really a lot more than that for us.
I'll also quickly mention one of the things that we heard when we were interviewing supporters of the Texas Tribune was this idea of you don't try to be all things to all people. You focus on policy and on Texas, and that sort of purview that is very focused really stands out from news that is part of the 24/7 news cycle that can feel distracted and distractible. Damien.
Buenas tardes. Primero presentar a Irene Benedicto, que va a ser mi intérprete.
Hi, first of all, I would like to introduce my interpreter, Irene Benedicto, that is my name. I'll be translating Damian since he is a Spanish speaker, and so I am.
Bueno, nosotros concebimos la membresía como la única forma de que exista periodismo independiente.
We conceive our membership really as the only way for independent journalism to exist.
En un contexto de alta concentración de los medios de comunicación y de caída de la rentabilidad de las empresas periodísticas, la única forma de que siga existiendo periodismo independiente es una alianza entre lectores críticos y periodistas profesionales.
In a context of high competence among different media outlets, we think that the only way to maintain rentability from media outlets is really an alliance between critical audience and engaged, compromised journalists.
Con esta filosofía fue que surgió La Diaria hace 12 años en un país muy chiquito, pero que está demostrando que es posible construir medios que no pertenezcan a las grandes corporaciones si nos unimos lectores y periodistas.
With this philosophy, it was that La Diaria was born in Uruguay 12 years ago. Uruguay is a tiny country, and it was really challenging to build a new media outlet out of this big corporation that keep all the control of the news publication industry. This is, as I said, thanks to this alliance between the public from the beginning, creating this community.
Thank you.
Gracias. In the work that I mentioned, where we interview supporters of independent news to find out not only about why they choose to support these and other publications, and also why they're frustrated with a lot of the news that we see, some of the themes that come up over and over again are that they want to see projects that are more inclusive and participatory, more human, humble, and very importantly, more unique in the coverage that they offer. And so I'd especially like to ask Natalie and Jess to talk about how do you push back when you're really trying to get your newsrooms to focus on substantive long-term stories, not just chasing what has happened in the past 12 hours.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So you may have heard recently in Austin, we had the Austin bomber. It was a serial bomber that terrorized our community and was very unique. It's very uncommon to have a situation like that in the Austin community. And it was a pool for all the newsrooms in our area to provide coverage on the Austin bomber. It's all everyone could talk about. And we have a credo at the Texas Tribune that really outlines what constitutes coverage from us and what does not. And in the editorial process and trying to figure out what to cover in relation to the Austin bomber, I pulled out that credo and said, how does this align with what we promised we would provide to our audiences and what we would not? And our teams did a fantastic job of sourcing information that was critical to the community, and it was widely shared and was depended on by our audiences. But we definitely felt the pull, and I think the 24-hour news cycle contributes to that as well. But we were grateful to lift up our peers who could really be the authoritative source on that breaking news, on another breaking news that is outside of the Texas Tribune's mission.
For the correspondents, our slogan in English is your antidote to the daily news grind. So this has been built into our DNA from the start, that we just don't cover breaking news, but that doesn't mean we don't feel the pull in the same way. One of the examples I think that highlights this really well, where we can address the fact there is a major event of major importance to our members, but that we are not the right people to address that at this point, was the bombing of the Brussels airport a couple of years back. This was a huge news story for the Netherlands as well as for Belgium. It was something of great importance to our members, and we wanted to acknowledge that this was something happening in their lives, but we weren't the right people to cover that at that time. We had nothing to add within 6 hours, not even within 12 hours, 24, perhaps even a week. We had nothing that was going to help us understand the structural reasons for this story. But we didn't want to ignore it. So our founder sent an email out to our members which said, we know this has happened, we acknowledge this has happened, but we have nothing new to add to the debate right now. We will report on this when we have something to add. And then we did a similar thing where we pointed to the news sources that were covering this in a breaking manner that we trusted and that we respected. So we sort of raised up the work of our peers, as you say, Natalie. And we did return to it a few months down the line with different coverage about how the media covers terror attacks, things like that. But at that time, we had nothing to add, and that was fine, and we left it alone.
That to me suggests a great deal of humility, to be able to say, not only do we not have anything to add to this story at this moment, but here are the other sites that we trust for the type of coverage that you're looking for. I think that idea of humility is, again, something that we hear time and time again, that humble news organizations are those that correct themselves when they're wrong, that ask for help when they need it, and that recognize they don't have all of the answers all of the time. And I think that example really bears that out. Another consideration here that I think is well worth mentioning is the importance of place and the large role that geography plays, whether you're a local site or not. And I'd like to actually ask Damien and Andrea to talk a little bit about the importance of connecting with a local or even a hyper-local membership base that may involve the people that your staff sees day in and day out in Uruguay and in Chicago.
Sí, en primer lugar, es un debate súper interesante. Yo creo que no debemos renunciar a la disputa de la agenda central.
First of all, I would like to say that it's a very interesting debate, and we are not giving up on covering the media, the agenda setting, let's say.
Lo que sí deberíamos es abordarla desde otro lugar, la agenda central, sin correr atrás del último momento.
What we're trying to do is approaching these same topics from a different perspective, without this urgency, with a more reflective point of view.
Y para eso es fundamental asumir que no solo somos generadores de información, sino que somos dinamizadores de una comunidad de conocimiento.
And with that assumption that we are not only generating information, but really dynamizing a community of knowledge.
Porque la base social que puede sostener un nuevo tipo de periodismo es el de un público sumamente informado, sumamente formado y comprometido.
These new journalists weren't trying to do target highly educated people that are intellectually curious. So we're really writing to people that know a lot about what's happening.
Y el desafío es saber utilizar el conocimiento que nuestros supporters, que nuestros suscriptores o miembros tienen en el momento adecuado para hacer un mejor periodismo.
And so our challenge is really to use our subscribers' knowledge to produce information or to produce journalism in the very moment they need it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so City Bureau is a local organization with national impact. That's how we frame it. We're unapologetically place-based. Through the last year, we did a study out of UT Austin, the Center for Media Engagement, where we tried to assess the feelings of Chicagoans about media, and it basically affirmed a lot of our assumptions and a lot of what folks have been saying, where the south and west sides of the city of Chicago often have little interaction with journalists, and it's usually negative when they are covered, but that if asked, they would be willing to contribute and participate in the media making process. And that is literally what we do. And so we focus on the South, because we're place-based, we are consistently accessible to folks. And that's why it really matters to us that we have noticed that in Chicago, neighborhoods get covered differently, often with a deficit lens. So when a murder happens, when a shooting happens, when a school closes, it's not complete and comprehensive and humanistic. And so to counter that, we do consistent engagement. We have a weekly open workshop series every Thursday night where folks can come to our newsroom and talk to our journalists or other folks within our community, because consistency matters. We knew that folks that we work with and want to cover, they want to know people. They want to know that you're going to show up when it's not just because of some bloody thing that's happening. So that's why place-based really matters, because it's a way to hold us accountable and to be really transparent and honest, and to make sure that our storytelling and the information gathering that we do is accurate. But then, with this study, we got affirmed that not only does that matter in those ways, in reimagining what it looks like to cover these areas, but it also helps you reevaluate how to engage your audience in a way that allows them to contribute to the process in a way that is still incredibly ethical. Most people don't want to be pandered to. They don't want to be told what they just want to hear, but they do want to be respected. And that's why, to us, place-based really matters.
Can you and others talk about the methods of that participation and how you actually do this? Because participation and engagement can feel, frankly, like buzzwords. And so I'd love to talk about the actual practices and the routines that you build into the work so that your journalists, and in your case, your young people who are documenters, are in active, regular conversation with community members.
So City Bureau has been around for 3 years in theory, 2.5 years in practice, and we run 3 things. We run a fellowship 3 times a year, which Bettina Chang is in the audience. She's our editorial director and another co-founder, and it's a brilliant program because of her. And so that program, it has reporters emerging and experienced working 10 weeks, 3 times a year, covering issues in the communities. But they pull from this. So we have documenters where anybody from the age ranges from 16 to 80. It's 75% of the geographic area in the city of Chicago, where we pay and train folks to document public meetings, most simply. And those meetings that they attend, oftentimes that living archive of information that they're generating, our fellows then use in their reporting. Or we've even hosted, so I mentioned the weekly public workshop series that we have. Some documenters have even hosted public workshops around some of the information that they've gathered. So for us, everything is in communication with each other, because we want various folks who represent various parts of Chicago to feel engaged and invested in the work that we're doing, and that we will listen to them authentically. I think the problem with a lot of engagement projects, and using that word as a buzz, is that it's project-based. It's not naturally baked into the work that you do wholeheartedly. But to us, from jump, it's there.
It's kind of hard to overstate the importance of that.
Yeah, I think we would wholeheartedly agree with that it's a question not if we should engage with readers around this particular story, it's just a question of how. So for everything we do, that's baked in. Also, engagement as a buzzword is something that we kind of very much agree with as well, and that for us it has to be about far more than talking back. And also that member engagement means different things for different members. It can't just be this blanket term. In terms of how we do it, baking it into the DNA has always been important for us. So if anybody came to the correspondent group therapy session this morning, it was very cathartic. You would have heard me talk about the fact that our correspondents, 50% of their time is dedicated to member engagement. So we expect them to spend half of their time speaking with members. That might be through our contributions section. That might be directly through events in our newsroom, or that might be in any other number of ways. So providing different avenues for participation. And that's super important to us as well. So for engagement for some will mean one email over the course of a year, and they might feel just as engaged as people who are actually coming into the office to clean up data sets for us, or going out into their community to interview people for us to report alongside. So it looks different for every member, and we try to support that in as many ways as we can.
Y'all, Texas is big. Newsflash. It's really big, and we have a challenge engaging and activating our audiences statewide. We got Austin licked. When you look at the other metros in Texas, we're doing pretty well there too. We know from demographic research that there's huge growth in the suburban areas, and so that's really where we're looking to establish stronger and bigger communities. But when we think about engagement at the Texas Tribune, to us, membership is the highest form of engagement. And that's a shift for us. Before we were thinking strictly about numbers, and that's been a change, going from using unique visitors to membership as a form of success. And it varies per target. It totally depends on how you talk to them and the medium and mode in which they prefer to use. But geographically speaking, it's a challenge for us. We have 60 plus free events statewide, and we know that our members aren't really going to those. And so we're trying to figure out the best way to engage those members through our public events.
In talking to Day Correspondent and Texas Tribune supporters especially, but this is the case for many, many sites, the importance of word of mouth, not only for discovering the site at first, but for making the decision to join and to become an active member is something that's really important. And I wonder, Natalie, if you could just talk briefly about some creative ways that you've encouraged members to even put their own name on the line when it comes to sort of showing to others that they back your work.
Yeah, sure. So we like to think about the ask, the big ask, in a few different ways. I think there's obviously a pipeline that we've seen. You can start off with a chip in or a small gift, a donation at an event or something if you really support our work. We do all of that. Rebecca's done a great job in doing pledge drives and street teams, and really thinking of creative ways to engage audiences. But I challenge all of us to think about additional asks, whether that's using the Girls Night In newsletter example, forward to a friend. We've even been so explicit as to ask for a forward to somebody's Christmas card list, or to share with a friend a PTA meeting. We really know that the word of mouth, and again, Texas is big, so the word of mouth is far more valuable than anything that we could say, right? Because when you recommend something, you're putting your name on the line, and you're leveraging your own brand and authenticity, and that makes a big difference.
I think also says a great deal about sort of the identity piece of what it means to be Texan, and what it also means to be an active participant in the democratic process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Damien.
Sí, nosotros tenemos distintas herramientas de participación, espacios de participación.
We have different ways and spaces to promote this participation.
Lo primero fue crear un centro cultural en la planta baja de la redacción.
First of all, we created a cultural space. It was at the beginning it was the cafeteria of the newsroom, but it became a cultural exchange space.
Y lo segundo es asumir que los suscriptores sienten que están haciendo historia al sostener un diario como el nuestro.
And secondly, also our subscribers came to believe that they were actually making history for supporting an independent media like us in Uruguay.
Entonces, siempre que podemos, los convocamos a o a conocer la realidad o a festejar que las cosas funcionan. Todo el tiempo están sintiéndose parte y siendo parte de la historia.
So we organize events as much as we can in our newsroom to get them participate directly in person in different kind of participation events.
Por ejemplo, cada vez que cumplimos años, hacemos una fiesta en la calle con 2.000 personas que festejan que la diaria duró un año más sin fundirse.
So, for example, for our anniversary, and it's been 12 already, we celebrated in the street, and around 2,000 people show up.
Que no nos fundimos, ¿eso lo dijiste?
Yeah, to celebrate that we're alive and well.
Pero lo más importante es, como decía al principio, asumir que somos dinamizadores de una comunidad de conocimiento.
But the most important thing, as I said at the beginning, is the premise that we are dynamizing an environment and a community that is already existing.
Y que hay suscriptores, que hay miembros de la comunidad que saben mucho más de un tema que lo que sabe la redacción.
And so that in our community, we find people that know a lot more about what we will be writing than ourselves.
Esto implica un cambio de paradigma para el periodismo que durante muchos años pensó que tenía que emitir en forma unidireccional y que tenía la verdad revelada.
There is a change of paradigm for journalism, which has thought for years that we own the truth and we were due to tell it.
Concretamente, lo que hicimos fue convocar a grupos de expertos, suscriptores, que son expertos, a trabajar junto con la redacción en verticales especializados en distintos temas.
So what we made it is we called for experts among Uruguay to participate with us to generate this content.
Que además son suscriptores, ¿no? Son expertos.
And so they are experts and subscriptors too. They have these two roles.
Entonces se genera una dinámica mensual donde estos expertos vienen a la redacción a trabajar con los periodistas en mejorar la agenda periodística.
So we have monthly meetings with these experts to set the agenda and to decide what to cover, how to cover it.
Y eso se traduce en mejores contenidos especializados en las distintas áreas que hemos definido, que son educación, salud, feminismos, ecología.
So it translates to better content in the areas that we have decided to be experts in, that are education, health, feminism, and ecology.
And for us, we do this very similarly, and we call it asset mapping. So there are assets that exist with the places that we work already, and these are things that they know about and they can tell us that exist. And the other consequence of this, so like speaking specifically about our documenters program, where we train and pay folks to mostly document public meetings, in addition to them doing that, these are folks that are from different neighborhoods and community groups and identity groups within the city of Chicago, who then share that information in those same networks. So not only are you getting folks who come in and contribute their physical labor, but then they are also acting as a distribution network for you, and you can like sort of track that consequence. And that's sort of the phase that we're in right now, is like we recognize that this is happening, so now how do we manage that and identify like the outcome of that?
I think that question of impact measurement could be its own full day here. But one of the things that this group talks about a fair bit in our work is defining what participation paths and what type of activities are beneficial to the sites and its journalism, what actually is impactful, not just busy work, that also meets members' needs. So thinking about their needs to be recognized, to meet members who share their values, to grow their own media or other professional development skills. And we think that match is a really important one. I'm curious for this group to talk a little bit about how you identify super contributors. So the idea that this may be anywhere from 1 to 10% of your overall audience, and it's not always the people who write the biggest checks or who give the greatest amount, but I'm curious about experiences that you all have had that have been really beneficial, not just for the financial bottom line, but for the storytelling that you do.
Yeah, I think that point you just made, which we were discussing earlier, which is about the fact that actually the people, for us, it's sometimes the people who contribute the most vociferously are not necessarily the people who are bringing the maximum value. Not to say that they don't bring value, of course they do, but sometimes the people that aren't yet contributing hold the most value. So we're trying to find some ways to identify potential super contributors that kind of aren't there in that space yet. So we're developing a system called our member Rolodex, where we ask members to tell us what their expertise are, their professional expertise, or what kind of expertise they have through experience, and we then verify those members, so they can kind of we can raise them up within the contributions and the discussions that our members are having. And when we do that, we're able to, if we're covering a story on a particular issue, we're able to invite them in and say, you have something of value that you can add here, not just for our correspondents, but for the membership base as a whole. And actually, sometimes just that ask, they're delighted to be asked, and it gives them the little push they might need to contribute where they might not do otherwise. So that's a way that we're trying to identify people who might not even consider themselves super contributors, but actually have a huge potential to be so.
And like we're still in our infancy in all of this, but the sort of like example that I think of when I think of a super user for us, framing it within the context of someone who's committed to the same crazy long game that we're committed to, which is like diversifying newsrooms, building trust, better local coverage in the city of Chicago. I think of Tanika Johnson, who was someone that she's from the South Side. She's from Inglewood, which is a neighborhood in Chicago that's very much demonized because of crime and what have you, all of the schools that have closed in Inglewood. But like, so Tanika, we brought in she's a photographer, and we brought in to do a public newsroom workshop because she does quality, accountable storytelling about where she's from, this neighborhood of Inglewood. And not only did she get a lot out of that experience, but then we were like, okay, why don't you become a fellow, engage with us, and become a fellow, our photojournalism fellow. And she got so much out of that and like language and describing how she does her work, that it has benefited her in other spaces. Like she's now presenting in local galleries around the city of Chicago, and she's still sharing what City Bureau does and where that came from. And now the next layer, so she is a co-conspirator for this residency group in Inglewood, and I am now conspiring with her to train Inglewood residents to become documenters, to talk about local school council issues and other things within the Inglewood community. And so she's a super user in that, like, she's identified ways in which she's learned from us, but then she's also like bringing folks into the fold to trust us in a way that like they wouldn't if I just showed up, right? And so that, for now, that's sort of an example of a super user for us. But again, like we're kind of in our infancy phase of figuring that out.
We are not in our infancy, and we're still figuring it out. I got news for you. It turns out everybody has a thought on politics. And so we have a lot of super users. We have a lot of people who are invested. We kind of lie at this intersection of media, nonprofit, and politics. So our people fall somewhere along the spectrum in one of those industries. Our challenge is to figure out how to put them to work, and we've done some of this. We've had them volunteer at our big signature event, the Texas Tribune Festival. We welcome them to have early access to our products, to find bugs in them. We ask their opinions. We invite them to join us online for digital conversations. But we are still figuring this part out, how to tap those people and those resources and that knowledge, and to use that to leverage the thing that we all have in common, which is an investment in what we're doing.
I think that's the inquiry that you're bringing to that really speaks to what we heard from one of City Bureau's members, which was the idea of play to my strengths, that not every person who is involved as a member in your site wants to be there in the same way. And so really thinking, and I think this is the day correspondent model, what is the personal experience and professional expertise that you can bring to bear to our journalism that makes it stronger for everyone we serve? Damien?
Sí, nosotros todo el tiempo, una vez por mes, estamos realizando encuestas a nuestros suscriptores, dentro de las cuales se trata de identificar mediante la respuesta y mediante la información que se le pide el grado de expertise que tiene sobre determinados temas.
Once every month we do a survey to identify what is the grade of knowledge and expertise of our members and how can they contribute to our publication.
Estamos trabajando en un CRM 2.0, en una herramienta que permita manejar grandes cantidades de información sobre lo que nuestros suscriptores hacen y dicen en las redes sociales sobre los contenidos que nosotros generamos.
We're working on a tool,
CRM, Customer Relationship Manager.
Yeah, CRM tool to manage big data about our users, what they do and say on social media about our content.
Creemos que la apuesta a desarrollar herramientas open source debe ser fundamental en esta estrategia de construcción de capacidades para que sobreviva el periodismo independiente.
We think to add in this kind of tools is crucial as a part of the strategy for independent journalism to survive.
Pero también tenemos que tener claro que no todo el mundo quiere participar. O sea, hay gente que solo quiere estar informada y sostener una mirada diferente y no le podemos pedir a todo el mundo participación porque no todo el mundo quiere participar.
We have to bear in mind that not everyone wants to participate in the same way, and so we also have to respect these other people that just want to be well informed and with this critical point of view that we can offer.
Solo el 10% de nuestra comunidad, compuesta por 12.000 personas, responde una encuesta y cerca del 5% participa activamente en actividades que se desarrollan en la redacción.
So about 10% of our community, that includes 12,000 people, are responding to this survey. This gives us a dimension of how engaged they are. And about 5% of this community is actively participating in our events.
Gracias.
Very high regular engagement. I think that's La Diaria Labs are especially well worth watching. Thank you for that. I want to make sure to leave enough time for questions because I know that there is a lot that this group will want to learn from these sites. It's well worth mentioning that none of the individuals you see here have membership director or membership manager as their job title. All of these are people who have different editorial and fundraising responsibilities that include and go well beyond membership. And so they are balancing a lot and are the perfect people to ask this last question that I have, which is, if you had one piece of advice, one nugget that you could offer people who are just starting to ask questions about what membership might look like with the sites that they work for, what would that be? I did not tell them that this was a question that was coming, so this is going to be direct from the source.
I can start. I would say that the best advice I can give is no does not mean no, it means not right now. I think it's so easy for fundraisers, membership people to get frustrated when the campaign isn't working. To me, what that says is that you haven't found the right message yet. So if you're talking to a group of, or an audience about veterans and perhaps they're not giving, I'd switch that message and I would talk about, the nonprofit model, or I'd talk about another topic, or I'd talk about, the media in general. I'd switch it up. So if you find that your message is not having its intended outcome, don't be discouraged, try a new one.
I'd say not only am I not a membership manager, but we don't have anyone in the correspondent with that particular job title. engagement is everybody's responsibility, whether you're a developer, whether you're a graphic designer, whether you're a copy editor or a correspondent. And if you're building a new membership program, building that in from the start can be hugely valuable, because then the responsibility is shared. We have roles where engagement is a much bigger part of their role than perhaps others, but there is certainly an element for everyone where that has to be front of mind in whatever the challenge is that you're tackling as part of your work.
Just to quickly underline that, as part of Day Correspondent's hiring process for reporters, if an applicant seems sort of dismissive of the idea of spending a third up to half of their time in close touch with audience members, they're not considered for those roles. The job is to work closely with knowledge communities to make stronger storytelling.
And maybe also interesting to know the way we work with freelancers based on that. So we don't just pay by word. Part of the way we structure payment to freelancers is based on they have to have an element of audience engagement with us, even though they're not full-time staff. So it's everyone who even comes into contact with the organization.
I think there's a lot, but for us, one of the things has been like, we don't make any assumptions. Like, we keep everything very open. So our membership is even in its infancy, and the first thing we did was we hosted a public newsroom where we invited some of our most engaged people to actually help us design what it looks like. Because even though we interact with a lot of them on a day-to-day basis or monthly basis, that doesn't necessarily mean we know them within the context of what they donate to or want to like invest in. And that's been something that we do in all of our programming, whether it's related to the journalism or it's related to the funding, is that we show an ability and willingness to learn and to constantly be learning. And I think folks really value that. And then they also know how to engage us as a result. Like, they understand that this is a learning space, mutually learning. And so it creates a different kind of community and community investment and camaraderie that's long game. It's not just like short term.
I almost now want to swap out all the places that I have membership for mutual learning. I think that's such a perfect description of what we're talking about. Damian.
Sí, nosotros buscamos un sentido de trascendencia en la pertenencia a la comunidad La Diaria.
What we look for is transcendence in our community, so to offer the opportunity of transcending the facts.
En contraposición a lo superficial, a lo frívolo, la gente que soporta un periodismo como el que hacemos busca de cierta forma cambiar el mundo con esa decisión de soportar un medio con una mirada diferente.
Furthermore than facts, the community we are targeting are looking for ways to change the world and to create impact.
Otro paradigma que el periodismo debe abandonar, creo que ya lo abandonó, es esa idea de vender objetividad. La gente en realidad lo que está queriendo comprar es subjetividad. Una mirada respetuosa de la realidad, pero que le ayude a entender un mundo que es cada vez más increíble, cada vez más injusto, ¿no?
This is another paradigm that we are in our way to disrupt. I think from La Diaria, I think that people are not looking for objectivity anymore. In contrast, they are looking for subjectivity and interpretative view of an incredibly complex world. So, and this is valid too. We're trying to make it more understandable.
Entonces, lo que le proponemos es tan simple y tan imposible como cambiar el mundo soportando La Diaria, ¿no?
So what we are proposing is as simple as and as impossible as just changing the world with La Diaria.
Soportando La Diaria.
That's kind of challenging of translating.
What questions do people have? I think that's such a great last note. But I'm curious to hear what you would like to know. And I think there should be microphones. There's a microphone right there.
Simon.
I'm standing in front of the speaker, so I just want to move before there's feedback. I know City Bureau thinks about this, so I want to ask across the panel. How do you think about how, not just membership, but the community you're building, and how your news product works to improve the quality of life for your constituents?
Andrew, do you want to start, actually?
I mean, for us, the thing is, like, we have so much community involvement because sometimes a news story is not what people want. And I think that, like, when you actually have spaces for folks to tell you that, like, that's where you can start improving quality of life. And so a lot of what we started to talk about is disrupting information systems within the city of Chicago. And so, like, how and where information is generated and shared and used for accountability purposes, that takes it away from, like, this emphasis on story and producing an investigative piece to, like, what do people need to know and use, and it frees you up a little bit.
I would say at the Texas Tribune, it's as simple as the work that we provide. So it's difficult to find news on politics, policy, and government, period. And it's difficult to find news that is nonpartisan, that you can trust in this space. So just the content we provide. But in addition to that, we provide tip hotlines, so people can email us if they have a tip, and we get a lot. So whistleblower support, I would say. Our social communities are thriving. So we have a Facebook group in which our audience has direct correspondence with our reporters, and we get a lot of story ideas from that group as well. We're on Reddit, which is kind of a new place for us. We're kind of feeling that out, but it's a great place to send our information out into the world. But I would say one of the best things we do is just provide access to lawmakers. So you remove the flack, and all of a sudden you have 100% accountability. So people are asking directions of their lawmakers and decision makers real time, and it makes them very uncomfortable, as you can imagine.
The correspondent works, everything we do is starts from our founding principles. And one of the founding principles we have is to make sure that our journalism provides constructive insights that people can use, that they can take into their real lives. This sits within what I think is called constructive journalism in Britain, and the solutions journalism in the States, but it's the same kind of ideas. And to try and provide resources and tools that people can use beyond the journalism. So this might be like a pro forma for contacting your representative on a particular issue. We've done stuff around internet security to, a kind of tip sheet for how you can protect yourself with your wireless networks, but also stuff that is kind of cathartic and about taking agency back. So we did a really interesting project around the debt industry. And one of the things that we asked people to do as part of that was if they were people in debt and they had all of these horrendous debt letters, the debt mail that you get if you're someone who is really struggling with your personal finance, we asked members to make art out of their debt mail. And it was kind of this idea of like taking this really shitty thing that you get through your mailbox and turning it into something that is like means something for you. And okay, that might not necessarily help you get out of debt, but it's trying to find a way to like symbolize taking back control, symbolizing that journalism can help you not only understand the context that your life exists within, but that you might be able to take some action, however big or small, to retain that agency.
I can piggyback on that. After Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, we put together a here's how to give help and here's how to receive help post. And we continue to add on to that as resources were coming in. And I have to tell you that first responders were referring to that story in order to kind of traffic resources and support. So we've also dipped our toe into this, and I have to tell you, it's remarkable what some community reporting can do. It's not enough to post a story. You have to support the story pre, during, and post with community as well.
I think it's a great example of leveraging your brand visibility for good. Another thing that I think is really important from what Damien just shared is the sort of the myth of objectivity and how this relates also to Date Correspondent. The idea that reporters come from somewhere, that they have a point of view, and the expectation that they are human and they're forthcoming with what they bring to bear in researching a story, I think is fantastically important as well.
And also that they can change their mind. Like we don't have anything that stops our reporters saying, I used to think this, and as a result of the process I've been through on this reporting journey, or my learning curve as we call it, and I now think this. And I think that's super important in today's context, because the kind of vociferous kickback you get when you say, actually, I've changed my mind, it can be really difficult to take, and to encourage a culture where, okay, I learned something new and now I think differently is really, really important to try and encourage that.
Sí, yo una acotación nomás. Una cosa es darle subjetividad al lector, y otra cosa es decirle lo que tiene que pensar, ¿no? Donde los periodistas confundan la necesidad que tiene la gente de tener contexto, de tener subjetividad, con decirle a la gente lo que tiene que pensar, estamos fritos.
Just one clarification, I would like to distinguish between subjectivity, meaning just provide a particular point of view, and a second thing, separate thing, will be to tell your reader what he or she has to think. So we will be sticking with the first version of subjectivity to provide context and make it more understandable. And those who don't understand the difference are dead, but in a more funny way. He said it in a more funny way.
Other questions? Rebecca.
Hey, girl.
Thank you. When it comes to launching or refining your membership programs, there are a lot of rabbits that you can chase down rabbit holes. And I'm wondering, and this might speak to what you were the group therapy this morning, I'm wondering if you guys have any anecdotes about rabbits that you've chased that maybe didn't lead to growing your program or impacting the bottom line.
Yeah, we have loads and loads of rabbits that we've chased. The one I talked about this morning, which I think is, can be relevant, the most relevant, is events. We thought that the event space would be really beneficial for us, and I think it still can be in the future. It's not something we're never going to return to, but events take a whole lot of resource. We didn't have an events team. We had one person and everybody else pitching in, and it just really took away from the central goal of supporting members, providing members with what they need. They were too small scale, and they also weren't helping us reach anyone new. They were kind of a preaching to the converted, which that relationship is super important. That's not to deny the importance of that relationship, but the kind of payoff wasn't, at the moment, with our level of resources, is not currently worth it for us. So we've sort of scaled right back on events. As I say, we may revisit, but for us, that rabbit is dead.
Solo un aporte más. Hay que asumir que la gente va y viene, ¿no? Y sobre todo si tenés muchos años, te das cuenta que alguien que en un momento pudo pagar, en otro no. Y si el vínculo es bueno, va a volver, ¿no?
We have to keep in mind that people come and go, and so along the years, the area has 12 years. Maybe you have them for a period of time, and then they can afford continue paying. But if you did well, they will be back when they can. So it's kind of flexible.
I think that idea of the long view is crucially important here. Also, I'm very sad, but we're completely out of time. If I can ask the panelists maybe to hang out just outside the room for a few minutes if you have questions for them, and thank you for your attention and for being here.
again from this morning. Yes.
Okay, welcome everybody to this panel on the business of news after advertising. My name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves when we start the conversation. I have to salute all of you, not only for your stamina and determination in showing up to one of these sort of late afternoon panels when you could be out enjoying the rain and a cup of nice British tea in Perugia. Instead, you are here, and I think you're probably here because you, like me as an academic, many of you as journalists, probably share my absolute obsession with money. That you are all interested in this question of how we fund journalism when the business models that sustain professional journalism in our parents' generation are so visibly waning away. I'll just say a few things to sort of kick off this discussion, and then I will, after my attempt to sort of distill some of the slightly pessimistic things that we should probably be talking about today, we'll turn to my fellow panelists for some examples of optimism, if you will, some examples of organizations that are beating a path and making a path by walking towards the future of what the business of news might look like in a world in which advertising will arguably play a smaller role than it has for much of the 20th century. So again, many of you as journalists are not necessarily intimately involved in the business of your organization, but obviously because your work is professional rather than a hobby or an avocation, you should be paid for it. And to do it well requires investment in your work, investment in the work of your colleagues, your editors, investments in the lawyers that vet your content and protect you from various forms of pressure from the outside. And just in sort of the thumbnail sketch of the history of that business, it's clear that for much of the 20th century, that business was heavily premised on advertising. For commercial broadcasters, almost all of the revenue was from advertising. And for newspapers in a country like the US, after the war, something like 80 to 90% of the revenues of many newspaper companies came from advertising. In Europe, a bit more like 50-50, but a very large share of the revenues of news organizations came from advertising. That was premised essentially on a set of simple facts of the market at the time. We as media users lived in a low-choice environment. This gave the publishers a high degree of market power because advertisers had very few ways of reaching us. Advertisers were never interested in the journalism or the news. They were interested in me as an audience member or you as audience members. And paying money to publishers was one of the few ways in which they could reach you. This gave the publishers enormous market power, and it gave advertisers very few channels to reach us. Now it's very clear we don't live in that world anymore. Advertisers have all sorts of other ways of reaching us. The advertising market is far more competitive, and for publishers, that means it's far less lucrative. The share of advertising goes to publishers is in very clear downwards trend because legacy forms of advertising like print and increasingly broadcasting are in decline. These are media through which we can reach our parents, but less and less the people in the room, and in particular younger generations. But also, even in that market, the digital market, in which some publishers are doing well in the battle for attention, our attention is worth less because the market is more competitive. Publishers have low market power in this environment, and those entities, the platform companies that can offer cheap, targeted, unduplicated reach, are the ones who really benefit in this environment from the advertising side. So the advertising subsidy that existed historically for journalism is in structural decline, and we can't expect advertisers to continue to unwillingly subsidize journalism the way they have historically. So what are we left with instead? Well, for some organizations, I think unfortunately it's clear that there are some who have just given up and are basically running a news organization on the model of what I think of sort of the West Texas oil field model of running a news company. It's essentially asset stripping. You're just pumping it for cash while you still have readers, minimizing cost, maximizing short-term profits, and eventually your publication will die with your last print reader. This is a model that we can see in some cases, that there are some owners are simply interested in extracting as much value as possible from the legacy business model and will then eventually, because they don't invest in the future, because they don't believe in the future of journalism, not only as a profession, but also as a business that enables that profession, eventually these titles will close. I am very glad to say that there are also many examples of publishers that don't operate on this model of the West Texas oil field model where you just pump it dry and shut it up. And I'm joined today by people who have led such organizations or are leading such organizations in very different ways. And all of them are trying to develop new business models to empower their journalism. And I don't need to remind you of this, but let me just remind you of how powerfully we've seen the importance of this journalism that many of these organizations have done just in recent years. The journalism done by the organizations represented on the table, but also many others. You know, we see it every day, holding tech companies to account, holding politicians to account, helping us as citizens understand the slow burn issues like environmental change and migration like our societies face. Journalism is as important as it's ever been. But of course, the precondition for that practice is that money is generated somehow to fund it. Now, I've said some depressing things about how hard that is in this environment, and for optimism, of course, I'm turning to my fellow panelists who each illustrate with their organizations different ways of thinking about what this business might look like in the future that will empower the professional work that all of you do as journalists. We have the Financial Times as an example of an organization that's privileging reader revenues increasingly. Of course, also advertising. Advertising won't go away. That's not what I'm suggesting, but it is a less important part of the mix than it's been historically. We have BuzzFeed that has been pursuing distributed scale and various forms of revenue sharing, in addition to, of course, also other sources of revenues, including the emphasis on the website. And then Gizmodo that has pursued a portfolio and a mix of different types of advertising and auxiliary revenues. I won't describe those models to you because I think we have the perfect set of panelists to do that. So I'll ask each of the panelists to speak in turn about the business that has underpinned the journalism that they have been involved in and how they see the future for that particular model they have been working on developing. Then we'll take a few questions back and forth, sort of discussions back and forth in the panel, and then open up for discussions. Because all of you as journalists, of course, have to think about what your role is in the business of news going forward. Because if you don't engage in this discussion about the revenue sources behind your professional work, then other people will be leading that discussion, and those people won't care as much about the importance of your work as you do, and we need you to be part of this conversation. So I will turn to Raju first. Raju, if you will introduce yourself, and then we'll go down the line of the panel from there.
Hi, Raju Narisetti, CEO of Gizmodo Media Group for the next 12 days. My last day is 24th. So, the Gizmodo Media Group is a bunch of websites that are built around passion points for relatively young audiences. They include Gizmodo, which is a tech site, Jezebel, a feminist site, Lifehacker, which is around tips around how to have better lives, and then Kotaku, which is a gaming site, Jalopnik, which is a kind of a cars and culture of cars site, Deadspin, which is a culture of sports site. And then as part of the larger portfolio, we have the Onion Group, which is satire, AV Club, which is a music and entertainment site, and The Root, which is one of the largest African-American sites. So the portfolio is about, depending on how you count it, about 13 to 17 sites. Fairly large network of audience. Last month, US ComScore was about 116 million, which puts us larger than most of the sites that you can think of in the US. And they're all owned by a big television company called Univision, which is a Spanish television company in the US. So that's just a little bit of a context. I'll talk specifically about the Gizmodo Media Group and revenue. As you all know, and as Rasmus talked about, our industry was primarily built around two sources of revenue, right? Which is mostly advertising, but over the last 50, 70, 100 years, especially in newspapers, subscription revenue. So I come from I used to be at the Wall Street Journal, so I come up from a very strong belief that we need to have multiple sources of revenue, and those two were the kind of the way our industry looked at. And when we all went into digital, 15, 16, 17 years ago, and in the last decade, most publishers very conveniently abandoned reader revenue and thought that they will make money on advertising, they'll scale, and things will be great. And as you all know, things aren't great because the supply of web journalism is infinite, and anybody can start sites and add to the volume of places where an advertiser can go. So I have increasingly come to the belief that the way we can sustain and grow media companies is to look at multiple sources of revenue. And while an individual revenue source will be under stress for all the reasons you know, and that collectively, if you have anywhere from 4 to 7 to 9 different revenue streams, you can actually put together a growing, sustainable digital business. And I'll walk you through my own company's example. So if 100 is, I can't give you the specific numbers, but if 100 is my total revenue, currently 21 is my display advertising, which is your standard advertising units. 19 is what we call programmatic, which is essentially machines, if you will, buying ads across a bunch of sites, including ours. 10 is video. And the reason it's only 10 is because these sites historically have not had a lot of video, so it was a capacity issue. So 21, 19, and 10 get you to 50 out of my 100 in revenue. And that's what we think of as traditional advertising. And the other 50 is divided equally into 25 is native advertising and custom content and our own custom studios. And the other 25, which is one of the most interesting things for us, is e-commerce. We have a platform called Kinja Deals. It's part of all of our websites. And in the US, we are one of the largest content-based commerce companies. So I have 5 revenue streams that get me my overall revenue. And if you think about it, only half is advertising as we define it. The other half is commerce and studios. So each of these businesses is challenged. Advertising is challenged simply because Facebook and Google and others take majority of the advertising share. And video is challenged because a lot of your video views might be on YouTube or elsewhere, which is difficult to monetize, and I don't have a lot of capacity. But because I have half of my revenue coming from native advertising and custom studios, and out of which, and then a quarter of my revenue coming from commerce, I have the ability to kind of balance out what's happening out there. In commerce, we are heavily dependent on Amazon. So you could say that, don't you have an Amazon issue? And it's true, because just like we're dealing with Facebook and Google on the advertising issue, on commerce we have Amazon. But the nice thing about having a mix of revenue is that all these are under stress, but under stress for different reasons at different times. So you could actually have a bad year in advertising, but you could have an amazing year in commerce. Or you could have a strong year in your native advertising. So collectively, you can actually grow your business. We grew our top line by double digits last year. Each of these was performing differently. And I still don't have subscriptions as a revenue stream, or memberships, if you will. I still don't have an events. We have events, but we don't have a P&L based events business where I'm not looking at it as a profit opportunity. And that this year, there are plans to kind of do both those, a membership model and events as a business. So that gets me to 7 revenue streams. And potentially, I could do at least 3 more, right? All of my sites are very US-based, and we have some international franchise relationships. So that is a revenue source if we do more of that. There is a syndication opportunity because we are owned by Univision. Some of my sites translate well into Spanish. So we could potentially have a syndication opportunity. That's a revenue source. And finally, we have a platform called Kinja, which is a pretty open API-based, really flexible platform. So potentially, I could offer that to others who want to be part of the network. So all of a sudden, I have actually gotten 10 revenue streams. So I think that's the way increasingly we have to think about media companies. Each of these could be, some of these could be small, but again, as I said, while one is, if the economy is not doing great and if people are pulling back advertising, subscriptions or membership could offer a much more steady revenue base. So I think the more we think about how do we add revenue streams and how do we grow them, gives us a chance to kind of really not necessarily always think in terms of advertising or membership or subscription, and then what do we do with that. So I think that's how I look at media companies these days, saying that how many of these can we add and can we sustain our business? Thank you.
Thanks, Raju. Janine?
Sorry, hang on. Talk amongst yourselves. Hi, my name is Janine Gibson. I'm the UK editor-in-chief for BuzzFeed. And I'm a journalist and I don't run the business of BuzzFeed. So I might be a bit low on facts and I'll just try and tell you a story quickly and then we can move on to some more facts. But before I joined BuzzFeed a couple of years ago, I worked for a legacy media organization. I worked for The Guardian for a long time. And I suppose the journey I would describe to you in terms of business models, and everywhere I've ever worked, despite me saying I'm an editor, I'm a journalist, I don't do business models, all we ever talk about is business models. The journey that I have seen has been one of endless diversification. And I would just like to describe what I think that looks like, because in the title of this panel we're talking about post-advertising. I don't think we're looking at anything like a post-advertising world. We're talking about ratios, right? You going from a 80% advertising world into a something considerably less than 80% advertising funded world for journalism. But the idea that we'll somehow liberate ourselves from the influence of advertisers, or whether it's voluntary or forced, is a bit of a myth. But where it is in the makeup of your revenue is an interesting one. And maybe 15, 17 years ago, as you described, when we all started worrying about the internet or being on the internet or being excited and enthused by it, it was largely an editorial initiative, I think. It was quite hard to get the commercial operations of newspapers interested in the internet. They were built around sales, whether that was ad sales or print copy sales. And their margins were very, very high. And the idea that you could sit in front of the head of commercial and say, we should not be worrying about whether or not we're selling that double page spread for 30, 50, 60,000 pounds. We should be thinking about how we sell some ads into this podcast for some pence. And we talked a lot about the transition from print pounds into digital pence and what was the point of worrying about that. And mainly, the numbers didn't really stack up if you were a person with a phone selling advertising space. And your digital sort of evangelist in a company would be sitting there going, we need to do product links in the things we do. We write about all this stuff and we could sell stuff off the back of that and we could link out to Amazon. And the commercial team were going, why? Why would we do that? And of course, now we have skim links. We do it all the time, and we have initiatives where we do them. And we would say, we must have sponsorship for podcasts. They're very, very popular. People think, it's nice that they do a podcast. It's not really going anywhere, but it's nice, keeps them busy. And basically, the newspaper's business was based on, its relationship with the news agents that sold the newspapers and the media agencies that brokered the advertising deals. And it's really not for me to talk about where newspapers are now, but we can see that diversification has been forced on the print legacy media, and they now are looking at some form of moving from print ads into digital ads, some native, some targeted, some Google ads, some tabular, data-driven ads. From circulation revenue, we've got a number of models now that look like subscription or paywall or membership, but they're essentially reader-generated revenue. But it hasn't gone much wider, I don't think. I think it's a translation rather than a proper broadening out of the revenue. So when I look at BuzzFeed and what we're doing as an organization, it's obviously a much younger organization. It's digital native. It was founded as an entertainment and tech company with those skills and that knowledge. It didn't carry advertising. It was a native advertising company. It worked with brands. It brought the knowledge that it had from publishing to work with brands to tell stories. And over the last few years, as things have got really tough and for everyone in the media, it's had to diversify. It's been on a very similar journey. So we do take display advertising. We do partnerships. We sell things. We sell everything from fidget spinners with lip gloss in the corners to best-selling personalized cookbooks coming out of our Tasty brand, which is phenomenally successful, and then one-pot cookers with which you can cook the recipes that we show you, and we show you how to do them with your cookbook, and we're not proud. And those are incredibly successful. For a while, we sold dustbins branded flaming pile of garbage because that was what Donald Trump gave us. We make feature films. We have a daily live show on Twitter that carries both sort of display advertising, like a TV ad, but also has a kind of version of native advertising where we do partnerships with brands to produce segments of the show. We're doing a show with Netflix. We have probably 5 or 6, I'm looking at Scott, who's in the front there, who almost certainly knows about at least 5 or 6 other things that I can't remember right now, but I'm sure we'll be able to talk about them. My point is that it's an extremely mixed economy, that it isn't an entertainment company that subsidizes news. News is pitching shows. It's more like, you know, quite substantial chunks of BuzzFeed are probably more like an independent production company than a publisher in lots of ways and in the way we're encouraged to think. Our CEO talks to us about 9 boxes, and please don't make me name them all because I can't. But the point is that it's a very diversified and flexible approach to the economy, and there is no way in which an individual at our company turns around to another individual and goes, "Can I get your attention around this idea?" And they go, "No, no, no, I can get much more money over here." Everybody goes, let's look at the lip gloss fidget spinner. Is that an interesting thing? Should we give that a go? Should we have a go at that? And I would say that's an attitudinal thing. I'm trying to be very optimistic that says a young company that never got really very attached to anything in particular is quite a happy place to say, what if we did a daily show for Twitter every day, forever? And that's how we're getting through it, I think.
Sorry, but just before we turn to Renée and the FT, I mean, I think that attitude that Janine describes of commercial people not being interested in digital is one that was very prevalent in much of the industry and is still prevalent in some parts of the world, whether those are countries with very aging populations like Germany, where a few publishers may believe that they are different, or Japan for that matter, or countries in which a deep digital divide means that the pickup of digital initially was slower than in high-income countries like India, for example, where some publishers too may believe that they would remain different. To that I can only say that those commercial people may not be interested in digital, but digital is interested in them. Renée.
Thank you. So I am Renée Kaplan. I'm at the Financial Times, and like Janine, I'm also a journalist, but I do have a few more facts because I sort of work on the digital strategy side of journalism. I'm the head of audience engagement. And it's interesting because for a change, I have actually a very different perspective and point of view because you've heard from sort of 2 essentially digital native companies, sort of digital pure players, and it doesn't come much more legacy than the Financial Times, right? We're over 100 years old. And both of them have made very interesting and optimistic cases, really, actually, for diversification of revenue streams. And I think everyone agrees that that is the only way to go, right? Nobody can rely on what had been the traditional model that Rasmus outlined. And so, and the Financial Times, like everyone else, is also trying to diversify. But what neither of them is particularly focused on, or neither of their publications or media are particularly focused on, is something that the FT is obsessively focused on, and probably actually would be the big hashtag word of this conference, which is reader revenue. I think that after diversification, everyone is now focused on the idea the only way forward, the only way for survival is to get readers to begin to pay for quality content, that quality content has to be paid for. And that's what the FT is doing. So the good news is that the Financial Times has actually always been in the business of making readers pay for content. It has always been a subscription business from the beginning, from its print days. And when it did transition to digital, like the Wall Street Journal, where Raju was probably at the time, actually, we were among the first to actually begin charging for content online, which at a time was sort of seen as quite heretical. But there's some good news, bad news in that, and that it's not an entirely happy story, because even as you try to get people to pay for stuff online, and try to transition from a model of print advertising revenue to digital advertising revenue, there's a very wobbly moment in transition where the numbers don't match up, as Janine was saying. And so just a year ago, pretty much everyone in the legacy media business was experiencing, in Europe at least, double-digit drops in print advertising. So 25, 26, 27, sometimes 30% drops in print advertising. And while digital advertising revenue was growing, it was a very small fraction. And what was also happening is that actually, not only was digital advertising revenue worth less than print advertising revenue, but it was going somewhere else than publishers. And it was going, and is still going, to Google and Facebook, who not only have the lion's share, they essentially own it. 80 to 90% of all digital advertising is on Google and Facebook. So it really does absolutely come down to diversification of revenue streams and getting people to pay for content. So on the good news side, the FT has in fact always been in the business of getting people to pay for its content, and that part of our business is actually going pretty well. I have to do pretty well because it's also a culture of very cautious optimism. But just in the past 2 years, the FT has gone over the halfway mark of its reader revenue. So now 60% of all of the Financial Times' revenue comes from our content, comes from people or actually paying for the content, which is pretty encouraging, actually, in a world in which there's so much free content out there, and actually in a world also in which the FT is very expensive content. A couple of other things that are worth sort of noting, though, about what that means for the journalism and what that means for the newsroom when suddenly actually the focus is no longer in a world of we can sort of produce what we will because advertising will subsidize it, and it is a world of a monopoly broadcast and kind of take it or leave it from the audience perspective. Suddenly, if 60% of our revenue and growing is coming from readers paying for it, and we're depending on growing that fraction, or growing that percentage, then we have to be a lot more interested in readers than we ever were before, which is why my job exists, actually, as head of audience engagement. Suddenly we care a lot more about how we get readers interested in paying for content. So even from a newsroom perspective, what does this mean? Well, it means that we actually have to think about, not just the way we used to sell content as a business. It was, well, in the first early days of print or digital, it was you could get a print subscription and you could get a digital subscription. And we figured that they weren't the same people or they weren't the same audiences. In reality, we have to completely shift the way we now think about how we value our content. And it's less about, well, it's worth this in print and worth this in digital, and less about device than it is about the actual understanding what value we bring to an audience. And thinking that maybe not all audiences will actually pay the same amount of content. So what does that mean? That means concretely we have to think about, well, how do we sell more people more content? We have to price it differently for different people. And this actually affects the journalism. It means that, well, we used to offer a standard subscription and a premium subscription. And again, it was take it or leave it. And now it's more thinking about, well, what are you willing to pay for? And do we maybe think about different audience cohorts and what they actually need, and actually maybe begin to produce content that they need? I'll give a concrete example. So more and more, it's about specialization. And it's about increasingly thinking about what people will be willing to pay for in a world in which there's so much free content. So we've just started developing a lot more focused content around deals and deal making, and creating a specific hub called Due Diligence, which is all about deals and deals making. And it has a newsletter dedicated to it, and it has a special hub, and it has a news feed, and it has dedicated reporters, and it has a lot of social interaction, and it has events. And this is basically a way of thinking about how do we get readers interested in something that is of extra value, or what is valuable to them. Concretely also, it means that because it's so important to understand what is valuable to readers and what readers will pay for, from a journalistic perspective, we need to understand in real time what they're actually engaging with. So it used to be, even just like 5 minutes ago, all about reach. We need to reach more readers and get more readers at the top of the funnel, if you understand the funnel metaphor, getting more new people in who might sample the journalism and eventually pay for it. Or in a BuzzFeed model, it was about getting more and more readers to consume the content, because there was also a kind of numbers monetization around sheer volume of readers. We've now moved away from bringing more and more readers in to actually getting the readers we have to stick around longer. Getting readers that we are already paying for content to continue paying for content. And getting them to stay and read more and remain more engaged. So rather than constantly thinking about developing new audiences and reaching young readers and reaching other readers and reaching the ones that we don't yet have, we're actually now, from the Financial Times' perspective at least, more and more engaged and more focused on understanding what are people going to be willing to stick around and not only pay for, but pay more for. So that actually translates into producing specifically new content for new revenue, for not so much new people who might be willing to come who never paid before, but actually getting the same people to pay more money than what they were paying before. And finally, it also means that sometimes you just have to take a punt, right? You have to, Raju talked a lot about diversification of revenue streams and being sort of scattered across a portfolio of different ways of bringing in money. From an editorial perspective, it also means thinking about, well, sometimes we have concrete evidence about what is valuable to readers, and that means we have to be focused on understanding how to deliver more of that to them so they'll stick around and pay for it or pay more for it. And sometimes it's also about using really good editorial instinct and thinking, well, is this a good idea? Is this something people would pay for? Let's test it and try it. But it really is about testing it and trying it with a view of eventually charging for it. And if it's not something that people won't pay for, it's not probably something that we'll continue producing.
That's a pretty strong finishing line. I think those who work in other news organizations might wonder what their content, the journalism they do would look like if they only produced things that people were willing to pay for. Renée, can I maybe ask you a follow-up question, and then I'll go through the panel again. In some ways, I mean, lots of newspaper journalists in the past, they worked for their advertisers. And now what you describe at the FT is a world in which you work for your readers. Is that a challenge for the journalistic profession to switch from a mindset? I think Jenny Lee earlier at the festival described this as a sort of prescriptive mindset. Here are some things we like, please pay attention to it and pay for it, to a mindset of what do you like, and can we help you understand the world in a way that you find valuable? How does that work out at the FT?
I mean, it's a really good question. It's a really loaded question as well, but
Somewhat.
but it's the right one because there is obviously a balance. There's a shift in the balance of power, right? We're no longer distributing to this captive audience. To some extent, we are only as good as the readers who will pay for our content, or consume it in some way that it generates revenue in many of the ways that Raju and Janine have outlined, But in reality, from a newsroom or journalist perspective, journalists have always wanted people to read their stuff. They just never knew whether they were reading it before or not. You were writing for your editor, or you're writing for your mother, or you were writing for some sense of pleasing an audience, but you didn't have any real measure of it. Well, the thing is, now we know. We actually know what people are coming and reading, but we also know who they are, what the demographic is, where in the world they're coming to that content, what proportion of what kind of story they're reading relative to another kind of story. Even as a newsroom, journalists have a much clearer picture of what is actually working and isn't working. That doesn't necessarily change what they feel is the right story, what they feel is an imperative to cover, what they feel is indispensable news and is valuable and part of the mission of something called the Financial Times to cover, but it's actually incredibly useful to understand how to allocate resource. So again, to give a concrete example, you're a reporter who's pitching the editor, and what you really want now as a reporter is to get your story on the homepage. Well, if you have a good understanding of what a really important story is, but also what a really important story that works is, i.e. that will get readers to come, to stay, to consume more, you might actually be able to inform your own reporting. You might actually think a bit more about pitching a certain kind of story. So it's not at the mercy of audience demand. It's not commissioning by numbers. It's not in a culture of necessarily producing what, you gave a really funny example before of I don't know what it was, but it's very funny.
Fidget spinner?
Yes, exactly. Well, we know that fidget spinners. Well, let's write a really engaging story about fidget spinners because that's going to go viral and social. But there is a notion of, well, if it seems like fidget spinners are bringing in readers who then come and read more content and actually might stick around and pay for it, maybe we should bring in a fidget spinner reporting. So it's a way of being informed by insights and not so much led by them.
If you ever come across a salmon-colored fidget spinner, you will know where the idea originated. Janine, you started by sort of prefacing your opening remarks with the idea that they were low in fact, and then you gave a sort of incredibly insightful and fact-based disposition of how BuzzFeed works as a business. But I mean, in your view and in your experience, how much should journalists and perhaps particularly top editors, how much should they know and think about the business that underpins their work?
Well, it is disingenuous and naive to suggest that we shouldn't, because of course we do, and it affects everything you do. I mean, I'd just say a couple of observations that I don't think journalists. I don't think I've ever met a journalist who thinks they work for an advertiser. I would just say that. I think journalists have an acute awareness of their audience, if not their business model, and if not their CPM. But they, even the sort of the grand tradition of tabloid newspapers in the 80s when they were in their full pomp, you know. When Rupert Murdoch was launching Sky TV in the UK, he had no idea what to price anything. He'd sort of built this business and no idea how much he should charge. So he phoned the editor of The Sun and said, "How much would your readers pay for this?" And Kelvin Mackenzie went, 150 quid? That's what it was. You know, that 50 quid, I don't know. But that was, Kelvin Mackenzie did not need market research or an army of consultants. Kelvin Mackenzie went, that. And that it wasn't, he knew his readers, he knew a Sun reader, he could spot one at 150. I think journalists are keenly aware of who they are writing for, whatever discipline of content generation they are in. And I also think that knowing your audience intimately, really intimately, is not just about getting them to pay directly for content. I would posit that BuzzFeed knows its audience as absolutely as intimately or effectively as anyone that takes registration data or credit cards from their readers or consumers or viewers. And that's because they live their audience, they spend a lot, you know, we spend a lot of time, we talk about ID posts, you know, when you're doing a quiz about which Sex and the City character you are, that's, you know, we've thought about that. It's funny, but we've thought about it, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the mood state that makes you share something, which seems trivial and tiny when you're talking about which Sex and the City character are you, or which dog most embraces your spirit animal. But when it comes to, if the read across for a room full of news journalists is when we pitch an investigation that reporters have spent many years working on to, you know, bring a story to light that they hope will change the world, they know and they draw on the expertise of what is the mood state, what is the need in your head that makes you share that with someone else. Because the sharing and the peer-to-peer passing on of that story gives it power and impact. And that has a direct read across to the value of the news operation in the world.
But doesn't the sharing also generate revenue?
It does now because we have some display revenue, but it didn't. That wasn't the initial basis for BuzzFeed. It was about the knowledge of why people share content, and then basically working with that knowledge with advertisers that goes, we can make a much more powerful, effectively ad for you than you can, because we know how to get people to share the 15 things that you want to see on Netflix this spring. And so on. And I have forgotten what your question was because I got off on one. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think just to be clear, I didn't mean to suggest that those who offer news for free at the point of consumption work for their advertisers. It's the advertisers who deliver the money that funds it. That's true. But of course, part of the genius of what all of you do at BuzzFeed is that you understand your audience and you get their attention, right? And that is the biggest investment all of us make in news, is the attention that we pay to it, and you are very good at that. I wonder if you can say maybe a bit more about how you think of that mix between the editorial talent and judgment. You described that from The Sun, but of course you exercise that yourself as an editor too, the judgment, the creative side of this, and then the role of metrics. I mean, Renée said some things about the role of metrics as the FT, and of course BuzzFeed is famous for also working very seriously with data and metrics. So what role does that play in how you run BuzzFeed editorially, but perhaps also as a business?
Well, I mean, one of the metrics that we look at most closely is one that's pretty bespoke, which is the social lift, we call it, which is the ratio of traffic that we get from people sharing something. So we sort of separate out the traffic that we get from publishing something on the site, and then we have a ratio that we talk about internally on top of that, which is much more important and talked about much more than the top line number. We don't really talk about the top line page impressions for a story. We talk about that did an 8.2, and you would think, what the hell's an 8.2? And that is the ratio that we create around Renée sent it to 20 of her friends, and then her 20 of her friends put it onto somebody else, and that's the sort of uplift, the magic sauce that sends a story really into the world. And we think about that a lot, but we're much more likely to talk about what is the frame under which we publish that content. What is the way we sold that story to you that made you first click on it and then think, oh yeah, that's what I want to send that to these people, or I want to tweet it, I want to post it, I want to share it, I want to dark social it via WhatsApp or whatever. And so, again, what I'm saying is we are trying all the time to understand you rather than trying necessarily to unpick the data. Other people at BuzzFeed spend a lot of time trying to unpick the data. You asked me to articulate what editors do. And I think it's, and I also should be really clear, I don't think it's a competition. I don't think one of us is right. I hope to God not one of us is right. I mean, ideally, there should be all of us thriving in our different ways with our different models. And we also ought to be able to, I think, borrow from each other a bit. You know, when the FT did its brilliant story earlier this year about the President's Club, which was such an important and fantastic piece of journalism, and really important for the FT to have done that, because that was speaking truth to its readers intimately and its power base. They put it outside the paywall, and they put it out into the world to make sure it sort of got the biggest audience possible. And that should be...
Right, and should be noted that we generated almost 0 subscriptions from it.
Right.
Because that wasn't the objective.
Right, so when we talk about should we stop everything that we don't think people would pay for, that's sort of the wrong prism. You know, we should be able to isolate things. And if we did stop everything that we didn't think people should pay for, then we'd need a really big state-funded media of some sort. And that's highly problematic.
Highly problematic indeed. Raju, Renée describes at the FT how, amongst other things, there is a clear focus on creating and doing journalism that people are willing to pay for. And Janine describes a focus at BuzzFeed on doing journalism that people find so engaging that they want to share it with their friends. It's sort of a very clear focus on a primary metric in both organizations. What you describe at Gizmodo is a very mixed picture, and I suppose sometimes one person's diversity can be another person's confusion. So how do you think about that in terms of how you make informed decisions in Gizmodo when you're doing all these different and sometimes perhaps somewhat contradictory things at the same time? Or is there a God metric in Gizmodo too?
Well, there are a couple of operating principles for the newsroom, and just to be clear, I don't commit any acts of journalism as CEO, so it's it's fairly church and state in that regard. And the two operating principles are related but slightly different. The first one is this idea around truth leads to trust and it leads to transactions. Right? That's the basic principle of all of our journalism, which is like those of you who visit our sites know that we are kind of in your face. There's a bit of a truth telling that is sometimes uncomfortable. But that leads to a lot of trust in the brands, and that leads to a lot of transactions, because that's the related model is this idea of like great content plus great community leads to great commerce. Right? So most of, and I don't take any credit for it, Nick Denton built this company when it was Gawker. The entire platform and the journalism and the way it's done is built around this idea that we are a place not just for content, but for conversations. The Kinja platform makes it very easy to kind of comment on. We occasionally, regularly actually have like a 400-word story and 400 comments. The reporters go in it, and there's a lot of like back and forth. Last year, we had 11 million comments on our kind of platform. So I think those are the principles that let us kind of then turn that into a commercially viable business as well. And it's done, I mean, the commerce team is independent of the newsroom, but because we don't have any relationships with the products, they are free to say that, I'll give you an example, they're free to say things like, if you're looking for a home exercise machine and you only have $100, you're a complete idiot, because for $100 you're not going to get good stuff. But if that's the only money you have, we looked at 3 of these. 2 of these are really, really horrible. We don't recommend you buying it, but hey, knock yourself out if you want to. This 3rd one seems okay. And all of them will have links to Amazon so people can go buy. We have no relationship with the actual exercise machine companies. So we can speak the truth about the products as well. And that's what gives our readers the confidence that this is, I like this place, I trust them. And it's funny, it's irreverent, and hey, I'll buy this product. So I think that's the way to think about the interplay of journalism and the commercial side, right? I think church and state, all of our newsrooms have a very acute understanding of that, and some of it also because we come from backgrounds that kind of believed in that. And that still persists, but I think within that you can still make very viable business. Look, we've talked about like all the ways you can kind of make money, and you can add, obviously, Janine talked about podcasts, you can talk about creating shows for Amazon. So you're getting to about 12 to 15 different ways a media company can make money. Or you could play the billionaire sweepstakes and try to find a Bezos, right? That's a whole different model. But a couple of points that I just want to circle back on. Renée made an important point that we spend a lot of energy on getting new people to pay and getting new readers. A lot of the smart media companies are focusing that energy on reducing churn, right? Keeping them longer, keeping the subscribers longer, which is why the whole idea of thinking about our audience as visitors, readers, subscribers, and members, and trying to move them down that funnel makes a lot of difference. Because if you get a member, you keep them for a long time. You're not spending a lot of money trying to get new members. You do that if you're losing a lot. I think the smart companies, most people haven't paid a lot of attention, but the New York Times has done a remarkable job of keeping a majority of the Trump bump that they got. Right? So I think they're in a much stronger position coming out of this for the next several years, simply because they focus on churn. So I think revenue is important, how to make money is important, but how to keep people, how to get more of their time, because at the end of the day, we are not really, while we compete, I'm not competing with BuzzFeed or the FT, because digital audiences now are so promiscuous, they can go anywhere because of our devices. So all I'm competing for is the single non-renewable resource my readers have, which is their time. And if I get a minute more of that, how I monetize it is my problem, but it's a happy problem.
Happy problems indeed. Let's open it up for some questions, and then we'll take a lightning round towards the end on how journalists should engage in these discussions around business. But let's get some questions, please. Here in the first row. Sorry, there's a mic coming. Just give one. There, 1 second.
Hey, I have a question for Renée. I'm wondering, because obviously when your subscribers pay for your content, you can either make them pay more money for highly specialized, or try to engage new audiences and keep the price low. I'm just wondering what has worked better for FT?
It's a good question, to which there's not a single answer. So, but it actually allows me to sort of add a point to what Raju was saying, where I think increasingly as businesses and even as newsrooms, we're focusing on figuring out how to give more value to the audience we already know and have. And so that sort of changes the way we even think about how we're trying to engage them. And it changes the way even how we think about what different journalism is worth. So I'll give a concrete example. There's some, some journalism is just not going to have the same volume of readers. It just won't. A very specialized section on capital markets and equity or currency will probably have a very small audience of engaged readers who we know are going to stick around for a long time. And it's probably very expensive to produce that journalism. And if you think about it, it's actually probably not even viable on its own. But there's a model of kind of cross-subsidization between the different kinds of content and the different kinds of audiences. So on the other hand, over here, we might be developing content that is very focused and specialized, and we know we can ask certain people or certain kinds of audiences will be willing to pay a lot more for that, which will then subsidize another kind of journalism that probably isn't viable on its own, but that is important to the broader mission, and also is important to the broader brand and the perception of what the FT is about. So that isn't exactly the answer to your question, but as a newsroom and as a business, we are very much focused way more on retention, and rather than sort of populating the top of the funnel or conversion. I mean, there are people, like, you have to bring them in, but even in the way we're thinking about how to metrics in the newsroom, we try to avoid talking about page views now, and we talk about article reads. And article reads for us are basically what percentage of the people who clicked through to the headline actually read through to what we consider more or less the end of the article. Like, there's kind of a percentage based on the word length that we consider, okay, you read it. So we're much more focused on, did you actually engage with the content and consume it? And if you did, then that's probably the sign of engagement, of a successful piece of content. And it may also be content that we can then charge more for, potentially, or ask a certain cohort, if we give you more of that, or more of something like this, or in a format that you like better, maybe you'll pay more.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Also a question primarily to Renée. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how, in your experience, text quality relates to reader retention. I'm asking because we are both classically trained journalists. Actually, we worked for the German edition of Financial Times when it was still around, and we paid excruciating attention to text details, you know, and we can't run this to the readers, it's just too bad. And in our observation, text quality in a lot of primarily online media has kind of deteriorated. You can get away with stuff that would have never made print at the Financial Times. So, but a lot of these outlets seem to do very well, and there are also young paid media in Germany, and I cannot really read those texts because they're actually very bad. And but they seem to work for a lot of people. So I was wondering if, in your experience, does classical text quality, classical handiwork play a role in reader retention, or do you need other aspects for reader retention? What is it that actually makes a good text that readers will pay for and stay as a paying customer?
Gosh, I don't think any of us could get away with bad quality. I mean, when you say text quality, I presume you mean like the actual quality of the writing and the reporting. You know, I don't think any brand, any viable brand, is going to be able to get away with anything that's not quality. I mean, especially because certainly from the FT's perspective, where reader revenue, people actually paying for the content, is the principal source of revenue, we're only as good as the quality of our content. But increasingly, as Raju points out, we're also competing not with each other, but we are competing with people's attention time. And on the one hand, you know, does that reduce the quality of the content? It can't reduce the quality of the content, because I think you then dilute the very identity of your brand. And the people who might be attracted to the less good quality journalism probably aren't paying for it. And
I can think of a very, very big English language site which has gone ruthlessly in pursuit of scale and display advertising, where you can be reading a story and halfway through the story will begin again.
Quite.
And just trail off and then bung another picture.
It's true, but
I'm not going to name them and shame them, but you all know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, but are any of us competing for those readers?
Right.
Probably
We're
not.
probably competing for some of their time and attention.
True.
I read that site, and I read your site.
True.
In the way that Raju says, we all on different devices do different. Who doesn't want to see someone flaunting their pins every so often?
You're absolutely right. It's true. If it is attention time, we are competing with the thing that will distract you on your phone. But I think certainly from the FT's perspective, that's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Where we're only worth the power of our brand, and our brand is indissociably linked to quality. So there's a perception of people, and now people are, consumers are pretty sophisticated. They know that whole digital, clickbait thing. Oh, that's a clickbait headline. People sometimes write us, that was a clickbait headline. The FT is going down this slope. Well, people are aware of it. So you can't sort of pass a quick one over on them. Certainly that would be my point of view. Yeah.
Mark?
I'm just trying to... Can I pose the follow-up question?
There are a couple more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, guys. We tend to talk about a binary choice between advertising and subscription, like paywall or advertising. But in the middle, a lot of people are talking about alternatives to going in and buying your $9 subscription or $10 subscription, possibly around paying for a better user experience, ad-free. We've scrolled Tony Hale's initiative. Discrete payments around event-based products, micro-payments. So how would you be advising publishers who are looking at the idea of saying, well, we're never going to have necessarily the kind of FT traction for that high-level, high-quality subscription, but we think we can get people to pay directly in some form, even if it's metered? How do you guys think about that?
I mean, maybe I can say some rude things and then people can say some nice things. I think the rude thing first is to say, I think we can consider it a fact that most of the journalism that's published on the web is not worth paying for. It's not an accident that people are not paying for it. It's because it's not worth paying for in their experience. And just, hammering up a paywall around low-quality journalism is obviously not going to solve the business problems of many publishers. So if you want to produce something that people are supposed to pay for, it has to create value for them. And then, of course, there are many other ways in which you can capture that value than through making them pay for it. And both Janine and Raju have explained some of the ways in which they do that. And of course, the FT does other thing than reader revenue too. But of course, there is this question for the people who want people to contribute. Are there other ways than just this bundle, which the FT is fundamentally still primarily a single bundle, though you are looking at new options. But maybe we can start with Raju. You were
yeah, I think it's a good question, Mark. The way to think about this is really around what is the value exchange, and there are different ways of creating value to a reader, a potential reader, and a potential paying subscriber, right? Sometimes it's straight saying pay for content, which is the subscription model, and there is a reason why I don't think that my brands lend themselves to a subscription, because while we think they're unique in their voice and tone, there are 10 tech sites that write about the same things that Gizmodo writes about, right, on a daily basis. So the idea that somehow Gizmodo is so unique that you have to pay for it and not find it anywhere else, I think it's a bit of a hard sell. That's why we are thinking in terms of memberships. And that's where the question is, what is the value exchange? So it's possible, ad-free, as you mentioned, is a clear model that a lot of people are embracing. I worry about it, by the way. There's a conventional wisdom that 80%, 90% of digital advertising is going to Facebook and Google, so that's kind of a lost battle. Yes, but remember, digital advertising is only 37% of all advertising spending in the world today. And that number is going to go way up. It's going to go to 40 in a couple of years. It's going to get to 50. It's going to get... So we should be very careful of encouraging ad-free models to get a little bit of reader revenue from that, while you may be actually walking away from a growing pie, even though you're only 10% of that pie that you can go after. I would still want to be in a position where if digital advertising is growing, still go pretty hard at that 10% of a growing pie, right? Rather than take a little bit of money from a few people who don't like ads. So I think it's important for us to when we think about these models, are we creating bad habits that are going to come and bite us later? I think it's important to think about. So I think the framing of this is and we could, for example, we could actually use things like print as a way to create value, right? I mean, The Onion used to be a print publication a long time ago. So, for example, we could potentially have a membership offering where from members, every quarter, you get an Onion print magazine back. Right? Create a little bit of scarcity out of something that they don't have. So I think there are lots of ways to think about that, and you're right in terms of it's not just a binary, give me money. And I think increasingly, if any of us adds up all the things we are paying for, it's starting to add up to a pretty significant number now between Spotify, Netflix, and all those things. So I think there's going to be a point when readers are going to say, I really don't want to, I love the New York Times, I love the Washington Post, I love the Journal, but I can't afford to pay each one of them separately. You're starting to see the emergence of Blendle and post-Blendle kind of bundling of it. The biggest worry I have is that we are spending so much energy, each of us, on thinking about how to get somebody to pay for our brands. In the US, for example, if AT&T gets CNN, if Verizon gets its act together with AOL, Yahoo, and all of that, and Comcast already owns big chunks of a lot of media companies. These guys already send a monthly bill to millions of people that we never pay attention to, right? Our phone bill and our internet bill. I can imagine a scenario where Verizon will send me a note saying, for $2 more, I'm going to give you all of my media, plus I have all special access to NFL and all these things. That's so frictionless that I worry that these, I call them melcos, media and telcos getting together, that they would come and completely upend all of our energy on subscriptions. So I think there's just a lot to kind of keep thinking about, but it always has to be a value exchange.
I mean, I would agree with almost everything that Raju just said, including that, and I really don't speak for BuzzFeed on this, I'm speaking as a former media journalist, but it has seemed inevitable to me for some time that the tube providers, the telcos, who capture a great deal of money, an increasing amount of money direct from the people that pay for access to that, need content. And that just seems inevitable. And you watch all the mergers that are going on, as you say, there just is there's a hoovering, a massive vertical hoovering up that's going on. And I would say, just on the knowing your audience thing, micropayments, no matter how frictionless, will work for certain demographics. And if you are, inevitably, if you are chasing a younger audience, if you are serving and responding to a younger audience, then that is less likely to work for you. And there is always going to be an important role for serving news, compelling news and entertainment to younger audiences. They're harder to reach. If you can find them, then that's great. And we give up on advertising at our peril. Advertisers need compelling content to be around, and quality advertisers want to be around quality content and a quality relationship.
There's a question in the back there.
Hi, my name's Inga. I work for CNN, soon to be AT&T, obviously. I just wanted to kind of flip that question a little bit around, you know, the quality of the content and talk about the user experience, because we can have the most amazing journalism and then it's packaged with, you know, dodgy display ads, even worse programmatic ads, and we're expecting the audience to kind of read through this and be bombarded with, you know, if you're over 50, this is the skincare you clearly need, or if you're under a certain age, you get, you know, whatever the cookies are telling them. And then at the bottom you'll get potentially in BuzzFeed saying, and now buy the fidget spinners, or in my case, here's a lot of outbrain, potentially, you know, brand damaging content. So I'm just wondering how long we think that the audience is going to tolerate the kind of user experience that those programmatic ads, the display ads, are giving them, and to as much as you know about companies, for example, like Scroll, how much they are the answer to getting a better user experience and still getting fair pay for our journalism.
To answer one piece of that very quickly, Inki, I mean, it's a good question, and I think user experience, and this to some extent addresses, I think, Mark's question a little bit too. A good user experience is something that people will pay for. And so maybe actually part of the way we think about how to encourage readers to pay for content, or indeed at least engage with it, whatever the value exchange is, part of the value exchange might be, I'm happy to pay, but it has to be incredibly easy and seamless. I don't want to have to take out my credit card. Or I'm happy to pay, but it has to be through social. Or I'm happy to pay, but I have to be able to try it before I buy it. Or I'm happy to stick around and read and stay longer and consume more of your content, but it has to be an ad-free zone. And so, you know, the value exchange may not actually be money for content. It might be something else for engagement, or something else for time spent on your site. And I think certainly what we're trying to do now at the Financial Times is actually, both on an editorial level, but also on a commercial level, figure out what are those value exchanges? Where are the different places, and what are the different things that we can be exchanging? You know, GDPR is something for anybody who's based in Europe, which is, you know, quite massive and terrifying and coming to us in 3 seconds. But GDPR, you know, raises all these requirements, obviously for those of you who aren't familiar, about what kind of information we can host. Well, that also, however, gives us the opportunity to say, well, actually, it is now valuable for me to get your consent to be able to market to you, right? If you give me some of this information, I'll give you some content. That may create a new exchange. So maybe if you give me some of your information, I won't serve you ads, but then I can give you something else later. So I do feel like actually user experience is a way that you can actually, is a good and an experience that, and a value that you can trade on.
Yeah, of course.
And also, the converse can also be true. You will pay for uninterrupted viewing pleasure on Netflix, and you will sit there and go, there's no ads, and it's wonderful, and I can watch 18 shows back to back, and I haven't watched a single ad, isn't that great, and I'll pay all this money. And if you really want to watch it, you'll watch it on YouTube on a screen that big on your phone, backwards, with 14 ads going at the same time and somebody jumping all over it. And if you are under 30, you'll do it, I don't know, for 4 hours at a time. And if you're under 20, you'll do it again in a foreign language with subtitles over it. So,
you're right. I mean, it depends on the audience.
Right, it absolutely depends on where you are and how much you want it.
Right. Yep.
There were some terrifying moments when we did focus groups in 2017 where, amongst other things, we asked people what fake news meant to them with ordinary media users. And one of the most frequently mentioned examples by focus group participants were around the web links. That was what people considered an example of fake news. That's fairly terrifying for a lot of publishers. So.
Yeah, my big fear, my big fear about ad-free experiences is that these are very lazy newsrooms not addressing the difficult problem of user experience. And they're saying, let's take out all the ads, right? Which is pretty dumb, I think, right? Unless you're a news organization that doesn't believe in ads at all, right? That's a different model. You're not taking it out for individuals. Look, my biggest problem with the CNN website isn't ads. It is the autoplay of video. It drives me insane, right? Forget about Taboola and Outbrain and all that nonsense you have at the bottom. It's the top that I'm worried about.
Duly noted. Please.
Tell Mitra.
So I love all the talk of mixed revenue streams because I'm about to launch a paywall on a magazine website, but we also have lots of advertising. That's how we make our money. There are obviously lots of commercial things and UX things that you have to deal with there. The thing that I'm sort of really concerned about, because I just don't know what's going to happen, is I have a team of journalists who are good writers, but have got very good at getting mass audiences. They don't do so clickbait necessarily, but they do sort of responsible political analysis, which is very good at spreading across the web effectively on social media. They've got really good at that when we had a mass appeal approach. We're going to introduce a paywall, and we still need the mass audience, but we also need articles and content that's going to make people flick and actually pay for that content and take out a relatively expensive subscription. How do you juggle those two competing kind of approaches, the mass approach and the quality approach or the subscription approach with your editorial team? Do you need different people? Are journalists better suited to the mass approach or the sort of quality making people pay approach? How would you manage that kind of split editorial problem?
It's a really good question that actually comes up in the newsroom all the time. And I mean, that is the great existential question, right? You trade reach for return. And what is the right balance? What is the right trade-off? And I don't actually think anybody has it quite figured out, and it's often going to evolve. But to answer that question quickly, you basically have to give your newsroom an objective. And whatever the metric is that is a reflection of what you want to do. As it happens in the FT newsroom, it's engagement, and we define what engagement is. And so when a journalist says, well, wait, do I want to reach lots of new readers, or do I want to reach subscribers? You have to say, well, both, but maybe in this proportion. So it comes down to what is the objective commercially, what does good return look like, and how many readers do we need to be paying in how much time? And so what does that look like in terms of your social reach? Do you trade off there? And you experiment.
We'll finish with a lightning round on the panel itself. So the whole implicit premise of the panel, and Janine stated it explicitly, is that there is not one model for the future of the business of news. There are different models. It's also clear that journalists need to know what is the model that their organization has, or at least aspires to. But I think one thing that we've heard slightly different views on, that all of you will be thinking about in your organization, is what is the role of journalists in defining and developing those models? So maybe a last round from the panel on what do you see as the role of journalists themselves in developing the future of the business of news?
Well, I think most business models just start with good journalism, right? I mean, that's the beginning and the end of everything. If you don't have that, then you really don't have any models or any ability to experiment. I think I would like all of my journalists to be data informed and not necessarily data driven. I think there's a substantial difference in that, right? So for them to want to understand what's happening, I think is important. They don't need to act on it and kind of respond to those cues. But so being more data informed and having a sense of what is it that pays for us to expand our journalism and asking the questions and being able to get the answers. I think that's critical, and not happening as much as we would like it to in most newsrooms.
I think the journalist's role is to know the audience, and nobody should know the audience, the reader, the watcher, better than the journalist who is writing for or creating for them, who knows what questions to ask on their behalf and to understand what they want to see and know almost implicitly, or without thinking about it, instinctively rather. So that's what I think journalists bring to the business model discussion.
Yeah, I think they need to be focused on producing great digital journalism, which is, and at the heart of producing great digital journalism is knowing your audience.
Terrific. With that, please join me in thanking the panel.
We only had a churn of about 10% in the discussion about business models, so it's not terrible. We retained almost 80% of our audience.